The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Thursday, January 6th, 2022. My name is Sam Seder. This is the five-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Assistant Professor of Politics at Mount Holyoke College, author of True Blues, The Contentious Transformation of the Democratic Party. Adam Hilton will be here. Also on the program today, Joe Biden name checks Donald Trump in his January 6th speech. DOJ continues to prosecute January 6 rioters. Are the planners next? Bunch of San Francisco teachers stage a sick out. Chicago City schools decide to shut schools down again rather than allow their teachers to do remote. Michigan Republicans seek to change voting laws, create school vouchers, and limit pandemic response in an end around Governor Whitmer. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, a bipartisan group meets about voting reforms. Just a PSA, do not hold your breath. Boosters for 12 to 17-year-olds now recommended by the CDC. As we hit a new milestone, highest number of children, 4,000 of them are now hospitalized for COVID around the country. New report, more than 40% of Americans live in counties hit with climate disasters in 2021. Postmaster General Louis DeJoy seeks a temporary waiver of vaccine mandates for postal workers. Meanwhile, 113,000 hospitalized in this country for COVID, according to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, up by 10,000 in 3 days. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you are keeping safe during this time where COVID... somebody sent me actually a clip of Chris Hayes' program last night, where he showed one of those colored graphs of the country as to where COVID hotspots exist, and the entire country is red in terms of hotspots. And that's basically what's going on. I can tell you that in my own experience, there's a lot of COVID at my kids' schools. The teacher is out. The principal is out. Half the kids are not there. There are substitutes. And the idea that there is like learning going on in this environment is sort of silly. And the idea that we're hearing people insist that kids get back into the school, and we're talking about this week, right? Like, we know what's going on in Chicago. The Chicago's teachers union wanted to go remote for a week or two because everybody seems to be on the same page that this Omicron surge is going to be short-lived. But It's one thing to say like, well, I'm not going out in the rain. It's another to say, I'm not going out in the middle of this hurricane. In a day or two, the hurricane will pass. Maybe there'll be a little bit of rainy. It'll be a little overcast, but I'll go out then. It really is absurd. It really is just absurd. And this is not even to mention what must be going on at the hospitals at this point. You have an uptick in 10,000 people who are in the hospital over the past 3 or 4 days. It's crazy. We will get to Professor Hilton in just a moment. Just a reminder, because it is January 6th, that the Majority Report's Big Lie show has been moved from January 16th to May 15th. I don't know what we got to figure out what we're going to do about that. To May 15th at 2 p.m. Better hurry. There's been a little surge of tickets. I think maybe people were a little concerned about COVID in January in Boston. May in Boston, sadly, you will not get the slush. You will not get the freezing wind. You will not get the freezing rain and the snow. You will not get stuck because the airport, because Logan is, getting snow. Instead, you will get a beautiful spring day in Boston, Massachusetts. Maybe you get a chance to go over and, I don't know when the head of the Charles Regatta is. I don't know if it's in May. Somewhere around then. You go down to the Charles River, and you go to the Wilbur Theater is very close to the Boston Commons, and maybe you get on one of those swan boats. A lot of stuff to do in Boston in the springtime. And Matt's going to do... Matt, what was your plan to do? Weren't you going to do like one of those tours? Like the Freedom Trail or something?
Yeah, I'm still going to do the Freedom Trail because I saw it in a video game once, and now I need to experience it in real life.
Well, there you go. That's an odd way to get there, but it's all the better for the history of the country. And it's going to be a spring day. It's going to be very nice. So folks can go to Majority Live or Majority Report Live and pick that up. Also, just a reminder, it is your support that makes the show possible. When you become a member, you allow us to be awash in member money as opposed to the massive amounts of corporate money that we receive from the Google Corporation or ABC or whatever they call themselves these days. And of course, our Peacock deal is long in the rear view mirror. We are no longer awash in the Peacock stuff. We don't even have any more swag, I think, from them. So you can become a member today. Join themajorityreport.com. Also, justcoffee.coop, fair trade coffee, tea, or chocolate. Use the coupon code majority, get 10% off. And if you don't have a scarf, good time to go to shop.majorityreportradio.com. Our scarves are wool. Everything's American made. Everything's union there. So check it out. Want to welcome to the program Adam Hilton. He's an assistant professor of politics at Mount Holyoke College, author of True Blues, The Contentious Transformation of the Democratic Party. Adam, welcome to the program.
Hi, Sam. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, let's start with just the, let's just talk about like sort of what the broad frame of a political party. I just want to start like the most generic, and then we will sort of funnel down through the different interpretations of parties, and then down more specifically to your work. But when we talk about political parties, just broadly speaking, across the globe, maybe what are these things supposedly supposed to be?
Yeah, well, Democratic parties, or I should say parties in general, there are coalitions that try and take hold of government, right? They try and assemble a coalition to win elections. Unlike interest groups, they're usually quite broadly focused in order to attract a large majority, at least large enough to win an election. And then they take hold of government and they use government to do things, enact policies, pass laws, and so on.
All right, fair enough. And so, okay, let's get into, I guess, the your work. When we talk about parties, or when we have researched parties in this country, what are the sort of, I guess, the paradigms that people have developed? And because you have a specific thesis as to, specifically in the context of the Democratic Party, but I would imagine also applies to the Republican Party, in terms of them being almost sort of like more, not as static, maybe. But what were the existing, prior to your work, what were the existing sort of, I guess, concepts of political parties?
Yeah, political scientists have approached this question of what are political parties in kind of two broad ways, or two schools of thought, you might put it like that. And on the one hand, one school of thought going back many decades have seen parties as principally creatures of politicians. Parties are things that, government office holders, such as members of Congress, might build in order to facilitate lawmaking, right? So that you don't have to assemble a whole brand new coalition every time you want to pass a law. Instead, you've kind of got a group of people who you agree, okay, I'll vote for your law, you vote for mine, that kind of thing. And parties also help these folks win re-election, which is something they care a lot about too, right? These organizations can function as service providers. They can help mobilize voters, they can create voter lists, they can attract donations, funnel money around, those kinds of things. So there's that school of thought, right, that has looked at parties as basically being centered around politicians in government. More recently, there's been a new kind of take on what parties are, and they've looked outside government, and they've looked at mobilized groups outside in society, that these groups demand certain things from government. They want recognition for their rights, for their identities, for certain kinds of policies and benefits to be showered down on them from government. And so the second school of thought sees parties as not creatures of politicians, but creatures of social groups. And then the politicians are, if not quite their puppets, they're agents, right? Is those folks are nominated by these social groups, elected to government, with serving as kind of the vehicles for what these social groups out in society, what they want. Now, both of these schools of thought have a lot to them, right? Parties definitely include politicians. Parties definitely include social groups too. But my take on it is that both these groups actually want to use parties for somewhat different reasons. And this can create a tension within parties. So I kind of redefine parties as what I call contentious institutions. Politicians and groups are both necessary parts of parties, but because they bring different demands to what parties should do, different thoughts about what parties should be, how they should act, how they should behave, then we get a lot of what you might call friction inside parties between groups and office holders. And as I argue with the case of the Democratic Party, but it does apply more broadly, I think, this creates a dynamism. This tension sort of drives their development over time as parties and party groups and office holders clash over the agenda and the identity of the party.
We should say your book covers essentially the period from, I guess, what you could say, the late '60s, in the late '60s through the Obama administration. So maybe you could say like the with the Great Society, maybe, I guess, until the, I don't know, foreclosure, the post-foreclosure era, I guess. But have you found, I mean, just staying with that last point in terms of within the Democratic Party, at least, and maybe this applies to the Republican Party, but that the contentiousness and is not just between the sort of outside perspective on the party, or maybe more the sort of more populist side of the party, and the elected leaders of the party, but within those two groups as well. In other words, is there internecine contentiousness as well that has marked this?
Yes, definitely. Not only do groups on the one hand and politicians on the other hand compete sort of against each other for control and of the party and definition of what the party stands for, where it should go, what its agenda should be, but there's competition among these groups too, right, within them. So politicians, whether for petty personalistic reasons or principled reasons, they compete with one another, sometimes over, say, presidential nominations, right? When we were looking at a crowded primary like we had in the last Democratic cycle, or also, mobilized social groups, be they labor unions, women's organizations, civil rights organizations, environmental groups, and many others. Even if they have overlapping agendas and do in very significant ways support one another, they also sometimes have not just diametrically opposed goals for public policy. For instance, some of the tensions we've seen between labor unions and environmental groups, but they also compete over a finite agenda space, right? They all want their issue to be the one that is prioritized. Right now we're in a moment where the Biden administration is likely only going to have a 2-year window to enact significant legislative change. And so that's set off a scramble within the party-oriented groups in the Democratic coalition to try and get their specific agendas at the top of the list.
Okay, and before we get into the details again, does that dynamic that you've described, both the outside and the inside, and within those different, two subgroups, does that dynamic exist in the Republican Party in the same way that it has, at least in the period that you've covered with the Democratic Party? Is there as much contention? And if not, is that just simply a function of the fact that it's a far more homogeneous party?
Yeah, I think what I would say about it is I see these relations of contention as foundational to what parties are. Parties can't avoid these kinds of relations, especially any governing party is going to have to figure out ways of managing this contention so it doesn't spiral out of control. And maybe we'll get to a little bit later. What we saw in the Democratic Party in, say, 1968 was a moment where contention was fully overwhelmed the ability of the party leaders to continue to manage it. The Republican Party does have those same relations of contention within them, but they have evolved a very different, what you might call, management style of how to deal with these kinds of groups that I'd be happy to get into in more detail. But what I would say to summarize it is that the relations of contention are still there, but the Republican Party has a long history of developing very different ways of dealing with those relations of contention when compared to the Democrats.
All right, well, let's put a bookmark there, and we'll come back. So let's talk about what happened in the 60s. Maybe just tell us what those different parties were leading into 68 and why that basically blew apart.
Right. So the Democratic Party from the 30s to the 60s, had governed over one of the most successful political coalitions in American history, what you might call the New Deal Democratic Party, that for all its stability through those decades was actually a really weird coalition. As probably most of your listeners know, it was a coalition that integrated Southern conservatives on the one hand with liberals outside the South, particularly in the North, big city machines in Chicago, New York, many other places, and that the inherent friction that occasionally manifested itself in some pretty dramatic flashpoints through the 30s, 40s, and 50s. That coalition was held together by keeping the party organization in a relatively decentralized form. And I won't go too into the weeds here, but basically, because each and every state Democratic Party had autonomy, had its ability to write its own state platform, elect its own members, oversee its own nominations, the Northern liberals in that coalition and the Southern conservatives could exist in an uneasy tension with one another, but neither was really able to fully dominate the other side. By the time of the 1960s, these frustrations were boiling over with the rise of the civil rights movement that was really encouraging and trying to compel the Northern, more national wing of the party to finally purge its Southern members. And then by 1968, you can fold onto this the conflict over the Vietnam War that was also pulling the coalition apart in a second way by pitting what you call anti-war hawks versus doves. These kinds of tensions exploded in several different ways, but probably most directly in the 1968 insurgent candidacies of Eugene McCarthy first, followed quickly by Robert Kennedy, that challenged Lyndon Johnson for the renomination. Successfully so. Lyndon Johnson did drop out of the race, but Hubert Humphrey, as vice president, stepped in and was basically anointed with a nomination, having not contested any primaries. The violence, the chaos that engulfed the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, also something your listeners might be familiar with, created such a profound crisis inside the party that there was, if you will, a moment of opportunity there for the civil rights activists, the anti-war activists, those who would very soon be labeled second wave feminists and others, to sort of seize on that opportunity and diagnose what ailed the party as a lack of internal democracy, a lack of transparency of its operations. And they were finally able to not just try and win the ideological argument or the policy argument about, say, civil rights or Vietnam, but finally attack that decentralized party structure that had for decades always been at the core of liberals' frustrations with restraining the extent of New Deal liberalism, Great Society liberalism.
Okay, and so we had this situation where because the power was so decentralized that it let a little air out of the tires, as it were, and sort of regulated nothing. Nothing got. There was a simmer as opposed to a boil over at times in terms of these. The contentions, the ideological contentions, I guess, that existed at that time. Everybody seemed to be happy with the process because it kept a lid on those ideological tensions. And to be clear, and just so that people understand, there was no, like, the picking of the president was not done. People didn't vote for the nominee really in any meaningful way. I don't know that most people realize this, that until, 1972, there was no primary process in the way. So how did that process work? And when we talk about, these different groups within the Democratic Party who wanted to change the process, part of it was just like simply democratization, which I would also argue, although it's not, that it seems more process oriented, it's also very ideological in the sense that, there's different outcomes that are going to happen if you democratize a process.
Yes, certainly. So how things worked, before 1972 and how they worked in 68 and the decades before that, this is really, not that this is a literal description, but this is the proverbial smoke-filled back room. Where party leaders, often those at state levels, had basically been able to monopolize the process of selecting convention delegates. And these would be the people they send to the National Convention to vote on the nominee. And that was not a public process. That was not a process that depended on or was even bound to the votes. There were a handful of states. If I remember correctly, maybe there were 17 in 1968 states that held a Democratic primary, right? But those primaries were always sort of a beauty contest, as they sometimes refer to it. They were opportunities for party leaders who still retained that monopoly control on delegate selection to take a reading of who was appealing to the electorate here. This was kind of made or put to good use famously by John F. Kennedy in 1960, when all the party leaders, all the bosses in the smoke-filled back rooms had considerable doubts about nominating a Catholic for the presidency. And so JFK's surprise showing in the West Virginia primary was a signal to the party leaders that, well, if a Catholic can win in West Virginia, we have a chance of winning the national election.
Well, so not binding, but more of like a, like almost like the trials that you would get at, when the NFL goes to look for like who they're going to draft. Everybody's doing the 50 and seeing how fast people are and that type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. This was a tryout. It was an audition for the presidency. But it was always just to send a signal to these party leaders that could choose whether to accept that signal or not. And prior to the 1968, I'd say about half of Democratic presidential aspirants who had done the best in these primaries did not get the nomination. So the primary system, the nomination system, was really different from the one that we have come to know. And in fact, the nomination system as we know it, which affects not just the Democratic Party, but also the Republican Party, is one of the key products to come out of the period under examination in the book.
And so, and that is, a democratization, relative to where it was, I guess, of that process. So the party coalition collapses because why? In the wake of 68, just simply because there's just too many disparate interests, or is it basically in the wake of the civil rights legislation the Dixiecrats go and then it's like a free for all?
Yeah, as Lyndon Johnson is famously said to have admitted to one of his aides when signing, I believe it's either the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act, we just lost the South for a generation. It would actually take longer than that, and I think it would be sustained longer than that. But nevertheless, what was happening in the late 60s is the fundamental axes that had been buried by the New Deal coalition, the effort to keep civil rights progress at a glacial pace, to unite around a Cold War framework. These things were simply pulling the coalition apart as mobilization in response to the Vietnam War accelerated. The civil rights victories were breaking through. It would take time. It wouldn't be overnight, as Johnson sort of predicted. But there was simply no narrative that could be told that would pull this coalition together anymore. Anti-communism didn't have the effect that it had had a generation earlier. And beyond those social movements of the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement, the second wave of feminism was coming online. They were also interested in gaining representation in the political parties. Then the beginnings of the environmental movement, such as we know it now, and later the LGBTQ movement, all these things would come and make more and more demands on this party. And especially probably what really was the nail in the coffin is that Hubert Humphrey, after this contentious and chaotic nomination process, went on to lose to Richard Nixon. And with that defeat, as I argue in the book, that defeat opened up this moment of opportunity for a relatively small group of reformers to try and reconfigure the party into a new coalition.
Who were that small group, and like what were their ilk, I guess, and does that lead us to the McGovern-Fraser Commission?
Exactly. Yeah. So this group broadly came to be known, whether they called themselves this or they were labeled this by many of their opponents, but they were almost universally referred to as the New Politics movement. And they would probably not include folks as far to the left as, say, Students for Democratic Society and the Tom Haydens and others, but those working in the civil rights movement, in the second wave feminist movement, in the Vietnam War, anti-Vietnam War movement, and the kind of good government reformers, Americans for Democratic Action, and many others like that. This was a group that largely united around the idea of party reform. They also operated in Congress. They made many changes to congressional legislative procedure, and had a general conviction that government operations should be more transparent. But they united specifically around trying to transform the Democratic Party into a more liberal, programmatic, and what they considered to be a more small d Democratic Party.
Were they elected leaders? Were they, I mean, like who, where did they get their power from to do this?
Yeah, they had allies in elected office for sure. George McGovern would be one of those, probably one of the most prominent. But probably most importantly, for the degree of success that they had in not just getting the McGovern-Fraser Commission up and running, but steering its proceedings, is that very few party leaders and reform skeptics had a better story to tell in the wake of the 1968 crisis. The crisis was such a profound shock to the party that very few could justify not doing anything, right? And so Hubert Humphrey, who had been the vice presidential nominee, who had been vice president and the presidential nominee in 1968, Humphrey actually gets behind the reform effort. I mean, not as a driver of it, but as the kind of, titular party leader, gives it his, good graces and says, okay, something needs to be done about what's going on in the party. These folks say they have a solution. I'm gonna say, let's do this. So part of, not just were these activists and their elected office leaders supportive of this effort, but there was a widespread acquiescence to this on the part of those who later, as I'm sure we'll discuss in a bit, came to be virulently opposed to the reforms that they started engineering.
And just to be clear, too, because I just want to put a fine. So these are activists who are party activists. They are outside activists. I'm trying to get a sense of, I have a sense of, maybe who those people would be today, or maybe not. I mean, who would those people be today? Would they be, I don't know, the PCCC, who are outside, progressive groups? Were they student activists? They weren't the SDS necessarily, but they were these groups. And I would also ask too, if that acquiescence wasn't also a function of the assassination of both the Kennedy brothers, of just sort of a vacuum of established power in the Democratic Party. You've just lost the presidency, and so nobody's looking to the guy who just lost the election to really be that strong of a force. I mean, was there, I mean, I would imagine at that time there was just sort of like, where is everybody on some level? There was just, I don't know, the parents were on vacation. And so that type of thing.
Yeah, I think that is part of the story. I think you're right about that. But the vacuum of leadership, what these activists and these progressive groups who, you know, today would have their allies in the squad, they would be, you know, readers and writers of Jacobin magazine. I mean, you know, this is a little speculative, but to rewind the clock, they were writing in The Nation, The New Republic. They were the Americans for Democratic Action. They were Allard Lowenstein. They were folks who had been really quite active in these prior movements, but had always been oriented towards trying to push the Democratic Party in a more liberal direction. Many of them had been students, and many of these activists, like Bella Abzug and others, would become office holders later down the line.
Had they been put structural reform before this? I mean, was these ideas on the shelf and they were just waiting for the, you know, and then the time came that they were able to implement them? Or were these like in the wake of what happened in '68 in that election, was there an idea that we need to have structural reform, not just also some type of ideological reform?
Yeah, there had been efforts over the decades to make structural changes. If you rewind all the way back to, say, 1948, and to actually draw on Hubert Humphrey again, he makes this really famous speech at the 1948 Democratic National Convention about putting a strong civil rights plank in the party platform that year. And it is overwhelmingly endorsed, and the Dixiecrats walk out, and Strom Thurmond launches a third party to try and sabotage Truman's election. And then in 1964, just 4 years prior to the crisis, the Mississippi Freedom Democrats, an interracial group of activists from Mississippi, had shown up to request that the National Party recognize them as the delegation from Mississippi, not the all-white segregated delegation. So there had been these moments where activists had challenged the National Party to actually exercise national authority over its state delegations, right? If this is in the platform, if Lyndon Johnson, you just signed the Civil Rights Act literally weeks before, why are you not integrating the Democratic Party? Why are you tolerating these state delegations from the segregated South, right? So they had been pointing towards structural reform for decades. I wouldn't quite say that all the reforms the McGovern-Fraser Commission unveils were on the shelf as such, but the motivation for them had been kind of percolating for decades, and this was the moment they thought they were going to be able to push them through.
Okay, and so the McGovern-Fraser Commission happens. Many of those reforms are adopted, and let's move forward a little bit here, because I was always under the impression that the reason why McGovern had such problem with labor in 1972 was a function of that commission, in part. I mean, McGovern had some hostility towards labor, it seemed to me, if I remember correctly. But part of that was, when we talk about the proverbial smoke-filled back room, a lot of those people were labor leaders, and they lost a lot of the ability to shape who was going to be the nominee. Is that the case? I mean, what you've written here is sort of cuts against a little bit of that theory that I was living under. But explain that as we talk about the sort of, I guess, the return of, what is it? The Empire Strikes Back, in terms of like the blowback on this reform.
Sure. Yeah. And it's a fairly complex story. There are multiple parts to it here. George McGovern was deeply associated with the New Politics movement. As one labor leader famously said, observing the rather colorful delegates at the 1972 convention, there's too much hair and not enough cigars at this convention. So if you take a look at, say, the demographic breakdown of just compare 1968 to 1972, the number of women who attended as delegates for the Democratic National Convention increased something like maybe 100%. African Americans and other people of color increased dramatically. People under the age of 30 increased dramatically. The number of people who are attending their first convention ever increased. In fact, even the number of union members increased. But to go back to your point there, so George Meany, president, longtime president, almost autocratic president of the AFL-CIO at the time, was pretty disheartened with McGovern's nomination and decided for the first time and only time that the AFL-CIO would not assist the Democratic candidate in the 1972 general election. So the reasons for that have been explained in a few ways. One, George Meany was, culturally speaking, fairly conservative. His relationship with what you might call the new social movements, especially second wave feminism, what then at the time was gay liberation, as well as even more militant elements of the civil rights movement. George Meany was profoundly uncomfortable with those groups and I think feared, perhaps rightly, that there would be an electoral cost associated with aligning with them. From another angle, of course, George McGovern was a famous anti-war senator and ran on an anti-war plank in 1972. And George Meany was a committed Cold Warrior. And there could be a softness on communism problem that he had with George McGovern. But perhaps most significantly, and this goes back to your original point, is the American labor movement had developed in what you could call a pretty top-heavy fashion. They had a lot of problems with organizing and educating their rank-and-file members. George Wallace's third-party campaigns in 1968 were prominent evidence of that even the United Auto Workers, who by then were no longer part of the AFL-CIO, had trouble preventing their members from supporting George Wallace's racial populism in the Democratic primaries, even in places like Michigan, let alone further south. So the labor movement had developed quite a close relationship with the Democratic Party, as I'm sure your listeners know, but that leverage, that source of power had been institutionalized in those proverbial smoke-filled back rooms. It wasn't through getting their rank and file members out to vote in primaries, right, which we've already discussed weren't binding back then, but they didn't have the capacity to do that either. So instead, George Meany would basically himself sit in these smoke-filled back rooms and say, okay, we're okay with this nominee, but not this nominee. And it wasn't that George McGovern had a particularly bad record in supporting labor legislation. He had one almost as good as Hubert Humphrey and much, much better than Lyndon Johnson. But by the reforms that the McGovern-Fraser Commission had made, had effectively dismantled those smoke-filled back rooms. And now labor unions would have to compete with many other activist groups to try and influence the nomination by getting their rank and file out to vote in primary elections, which is a hard thing to do.
And then we had something called the Coalition for a Democratic Majority that that pushes back on these reforms. Who were they, and what did that pushback lead to?
Yeah, so the Coalition for a Democratic Majority, or the CDM for short, mobilized in the wake of George McGovern's devastating landslide defeat to Richard Nixon in November 1972. And this was a coalition of basically everyone who found themselves on the losing side of the McGovern-Fraser reforms. So these were many, though not all, prominent labor leaders, many Cold Warriors, foreign policy hawks, who saw McGovern and the New Politics movement as jeopardizing American foreign policy, not just in Vietnam, but in the wider conflict with the Soviet Union. And many of those cultural conservatives that saw Great Society liberalism, women's liberation, Black Power, and the nascent LGBTQ movement as simply distasteful, as going too far, as asking for too much. And many of these leading members of the CDM would actually later, they had been kind of New Deal Johnsonian Democrats in the 1960s, but they would later, by the 1980s, find many of themselves would find themselves working in the Reagan administration. So these are, another way of putting it, Sam, sorry, is just, this is, if you will, the nascent glimmerings of what we would later call neoconservatism.
Okay, and that is where you have former Democrats and former liberals who, I guess, decided that things had just gone too far, essentially. Still have taxes, but everything else went too far.
Yeah, exactly. The welfare state is creating a population of dependent underclass, stuff that would congeal into a national narrative later by the late 70s and the 1980s. But we could see it at the beginnings in the CDM and basically people who, they were not Republicans, they were not conservatives, but they took a reactionary stance to the new politics and saw the reforms of the Democratic Party as jeopardizing the hold that they had on that party in the decades prior.
And it seems to me that you can't really cordon those people off, right? I mean, those are like, they left and went to the Republican Party and became the neoconservatives, but there is sort of like a spectrum, right? Like, even like you have a guy like Moynihan, the former senator from New York, he feels like he was on that spectrum. Even when you get up to Bill Clinton, who had, sort of more fealty towards corporations and big money, that all seems like a cascading, or a spectrum that was in reaction to McGovern's loss in many respects, it seems to me. Even as late as the aughts, we were, the online community was still talking about hippie punching. And that's how much that resonated through the Democratic Party. So with the people who stayed, within the spectrum and stayed in the Democratic Party, you argue that the party became an advocacy party. What does that mean?
Yeah, that refers to, a few things. At an institutional level, I argue that the party has compensated for its inabilities to mobilize voters, to deploy state and local organizations, to recruit talented, organizers, to build a large electoral majority. It's compensated for what you might call that institutional hollowness with advocates, by relying on social movement groups, interest groups, online advocates, the online community, others. Basically, it's outsourced a lot of the functions that we would consider to be kind of essential in-house party functions out to this constellation of party-oriented groups who, if you will, sort of orbit the Democratic Party. And that's had certain consequences, right? The advocacy party, in some good ways, has significantly diversified the identity of the party, what it stands for, the issues that it's committed to. And it kind of has to. I mean, it is reliant on these groups for help with elections, for help with legislative functions, including even designing bills, designing policy, implementing policy. So it's got to give back to these groups in some ways. And if we fast forward all the way to the present, I think that's kind of how we can explain what the Democratic Party has become in the last few electoral cycles. But at the same time, the advocacy party, because it's hollow, because it doesn't have a lot of internal organization to it, it's also fairly thin and fragile and really requires, or I should say is maybe dependent on, presidential leadership to pull that party together, right? And define a distinct agenda for it to follow. And that, I think, has the bad consequence of sort of elevating the president, if the party holds the White House, above the party itself. And that's kind of not what you think of when you think of as someone being a party leader. They should be a creature of that organization, and not the other way around, where that party organization kind of serves to function or functions to serve the interests and ambitions of that presidential leader.
Okay, and it also seems to me that, like, when you have that type of sort of like hollow, you're almost describing on some level like an egg, on some level, like there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity to sort of take hold of that apparatus because it is sort of so paper thin in terms of its structure. But before we get there, if I understand what happened, is the Democratic Party was almost like a confederacy at one point, and when it reformed and became more centralized, there was just not a movement to create the institutions that would shore up, like those institutions of those Confederate of the Confederates were not replaced. They were just disempowered, and therefore we go through this period of time where, like, it was the party was taken over in many respects by just the people who had the money, because there was no apparatus that they needed to necessarily control. The apparatus was very much outsourced, and it became outsourced even more so through these different groups. And tell me where I'm not, if I've strayed from that, from what you've argued. But that's what it appears that we have. We have this now. There's no longer sort of an organic confederacy, as it were. It is sort of just sort of these groups that ebb and flow and have been contingent upon money. And so when Bernie Sanders shows up in 2016 and is able to drive, to raise his own money, essentially, and create his own organization. In fact, you could argue Howard Dean was the precursor to this, putting aside the ideological issues. But for that moment, Howard Dean appeared to be, the candidate of the left, at least as it was constructed at that time. That's why Bernie Sanders was able to sort of usurp things in the way that he did, because there is no party structure that one would have expected to have grown up over the past 30 years that ultimately replaced these separate sort of fiefdoms that existed regionally or in terms of states. Is that essentially what we're looking at?
Yeah, I think your conclusion about what we're looking at is absolutely right. Like, to use a phrase, there's just no there when it comes to the Democratic Party. But
Republicans, like, contrast that for the Republicans, because I'm curious, like, is it the RNC is that much more powerful, or is it there's just like two or three sort of sources of power within the Republican Party that function in the same way that the sort of like many, many disparate groups in the Democratic Party do?
Yeah, I think the fundamental contrast there, and maybe then I'll swing back to the Democratic hollowness, is I really don't think the Republican Party is hollow. To quickly rewind, way back 1960s and on, the Democratic Party leadership, so the DNC, Democratic presidents when they held the White House, were self-assured that they had a natural governing majority going forward. They did not invest in building state and local organizations. They won majorities in the House, the Senate, and the presidency over and over and over again from the 30s on. So they had the broadest, secure hold on the electorate and so on. The Republican Party, by contrast, was seemingly stuck in minority status from 1932 on. I mean, yes, they captured the presidency here and there. They captured the Senate for a few seconds in the 50s and then in the 80s. It took them a long time to win the House majority in any kind of secure way. So through all those decades, from the 50s on, the Republican Party is investing massive amounts of money in building state and local organizations. So organizationally, in the way that the Democratic Party is hollowed out and dependent on these outside advocates to serve the functions that it doesn't have in-house capacities for, the Republican Party has a robust, well-oiled machine of a party organization. Now, it doesn't mean they can't control who gets the nomination or not, right? The McGovern-Fraser reform saw to that. But it does mean that when that party did belatedly develop alliances with mass movements, because you remember the Republican Party had nothing like the labor movement in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, even the 70s, but belatedly develops this relationship with the Christian right. It now has, if you will, a robust party organization that is colonized by the ideological activists. So the Democratic Party is hollow. It's got its groups, but those groups don't have, if you will, anything to grab onto. The Republicans, on the other hand, have the groups now and the robust organization, and they've merged the two. And that's what's so dangerous about the Republican Party. Now, to go back to the Democrats, their historical evolution here is the New Politics movement and the McGovern-Fraser reformers didn't just want to open the party, right, through primary elections. They wanted to build that national organization that, as you noted before, is dramatically missing now. And they made huge proposals to have national policy conferences, just like social democratic parties have in Europe, where you hold an off-cycle convention, not to nominate anybody, but to plan strategy for the leaders to be held accountable to the membership. They wanted to have a membership. American parties don't have memberships. They wanted to implement a dues-paying membership. They wanted to have strict platform control so that party leaders couldn't just endorse a platform and then walk away from it. They would have to be held accountable to that platform. And the CDM, the group we talked about before, were instrumental in torpedoing those more far-reaching reforms. So all those things that you'll note are absent from the party were proposed, and significant amount of work was poured into trying to develop those. But with McGovern's loss and the mobilization of the CDM, they were able to subvert that second part of the reform agenda. And so instead, what we got was a party wide open, right, where the old structures had been fundamentally dismantled, but new structures had not been built to take their place.
So, I mean, and the irony is that, I think a lot of, certainly a lot of supporters or some measure of supporters of Bernie Sanders felt like this, party apparatus crushed them. But the reality is that there is no party apparatus. and that which on one hand represents a challenge insofar as that there's nothing for, let's say, the left or progressives, those who want to engage with the Democratic Party, maybe are to the left of where it is ideologically, and then there's nothing for them to necessarily take over at this point because none of that's been built. But it also seems to me that it also provides an opportunity that you could, you know, in the Republican side, like the Koch brothers had created a parallel network, it seems to me, with the Republican Party. Now, maybe they shared power, maybe they sort of people vacillated back and forth, but these are two apparatus that exist. And some people probably put foot in both of those camps and exploited that. There's an opportunity for, let's say, like a DSA, theoretically, to create its own apparatus, or maybe unions, or I don't know, to create its own apparatus. You don't necessarily have to be that powerful because you're not competing against any type of really organization within the context of the Democratic Party. Is that your sense?
Yeah, exactly. I would say theoretically, DSA or a comparable coalition of organizations could build such a, party surrogate or shadow party or whatever you want to call it, because like the metaphor of the egg, right, is once you're past that shell, right, there's nothing inside there that's really going to stop you. And personally, I was a big supporter of Bernie Sanders, and I appreciated and was very enthusiastic about the kind of politics he was bringing out into the open in the Democratic Party, and I think he left it much better than he found it. But no, there was no cabal. I mean, yes, the DNC found him extremely annoying, as the WikiLeaks DNC memos reveal. But no, they couldn't. There weren't any shenanigans that they could pull. There were no secret levers to pull to deny him that nomination. Clinton and Biden outcompeted him. But he lost fair and square. Yeah, they scheduled some debates during, non-prime time or that kind of thing. But, that's not like the old days. The old days in the smoke-filled back rooms, George Meany would just nod his head one way or the other, and that person would get the nomination. The DNC or anybody in the party no longer has that kind of power.
Well, we saw Howard Dean try and push for a 50-state strategy on some level, right? That's what they were talking about, was like, let's build a cohesive, almost maybe top-down or a hierarchical structure, but one that actually, is invested in at every level, as opposed to now where there's just sort of like a figurehead at the top of this and hoping to corral these various different groups, which in any given cycle may be a totally different profile of groups.
Yeah, that's right. And the building Democratic Party organizations at state and local levels across all 50 states, is a bare minimum of what they need to do. What the Republican Party figured out is that in addition to their robust network of party organizations, they could link those organizations and develop close ties with, say, chambers of commerce, church organizations, study groups on campuses, those kinds of things. And the Democratic Party could benefit from doing more of that. And what would be most fundamental would, of course, be rebuilding labor unions, of actually using policy, which, and the Republicans have this figured out too, which is why they're constantly undermining private and public sector unions, but that those organizations could plug in, if you will, to Democratic organizational networks in ways where, they're not just floating out there to be mobilized come election season, but that you actually build a durable framework there so that you can build a source of political power. And, you can't do that at the national level. In this sense, you go back to that favorite aphorism that all politics is local. This has to be done extensively across the country for many reasons. I mean, not just to affect state and local laws and policy, but also because we know that electoral strategy, the Electoral College and other biases in the electoral system impose on us the need to organize extensively across many states, not just really, really well in some states.
It's interesting because I feel like the Sanders campaign attempted to sort of to exploit the infrastructure. They did a lot in terms of like supporting strikes and labor actions as a campaign, which was in many respects like fairly innovative. But the problem was that there was no infrastructure that they could connect to. That every time that they made these connections, there was a limit as to how far-reaching those connections could be because there's been no infrastructure that has been built around those people that they were connecting with.
Yeah, and as you phrased it correctly, right? It was a campaign that was supporting these strikes, these movements, and so on. What we're talking about in the organizational sense would be a party that supports these groups and these efforts. And yeah, and we don't see that.
All right, before we go, do you see are there any green shoots? Is there, they call it green stems or any, I mean, like, do we see that happening anywhere? Or is it like, maybe it's the DSA or maybe it's, I don't know.
I mean, the DSA has been, successful in some venues, New York, places in Virginia, I believe in California too. They've been small, but significant. I would say though, more broadly, I mean, whether or not we see an organizational infrastructure being put in place, I would say there's something clearly happening in the Democratic Party right now where, we expected with Biden, right, to get someone, as he said, where nothing will fundamentally change. And instead, big, bold change has been his preferred way to go. Whether or not he gets that all enacted, that has clearly been the direction he wants to go with social policy, climate policy, and so on. To me, that suggests that, say, unlike Clinton, who I discuss in the book as largely being a part of a resistance movement against the nature of the advocacy party, that Biden in some ways is taking more of a page from the Obama playbook and is trying to play party leader by recognizing that, well, this is a party that is animated by these progressive social groups. And yes, he's constrained and he has to walk a fine line of trying to keep these razor thin majorities together in Congress. But nonetheless, I think in many significant ways, this might be the most progressive the Democratic Party has really ever been. Because if we could rewind all the way to the 60s and to the 30s, those were very boldly progressive Democratic majorities. They had substantial room, right, because their majorities were so large. But those programs and those efforts were also deeply compromised by their alliance with Southern conservatives. Now we're at a point where those Southern conservatives are gone, and this party is, 98% united around a pretty bold progressive agenda. Now, it could, of course, be bolder. I would like it to be bolder. I would like it to be more redistributive in its economic nature. But when we track this party from, say, 2000 to the present, I think it's a party that is not only appearing more progressive because Republicans have moved so far to the right, but a Democratic Party that is on its own terms, I think, moving more to the left.
But the party may be moving to the left, even though the leadership hasn't quite gotten there. And on some level, the winds may be blowing, but the sails have all sorts of holes in it. And it's really not really making a difference in terms of moving the ship. But there's also, the ideology is not it's one thing to say that ideologically the center of the party has moved left, which I think it has. I don't think that the leadership has been responsive yet, and I think there's some, massive problems in terms of like its relationship to corporations or to banking or finance or whatnot. But that doesn't speak to the apparatus at all. There doesn't seem to be any improvement in the apparatus whatsoever, and there seems to be a real problem with the party apparatus, just looking at like in terms of like a competence thing, that, and it may be corrupted because of the nature of the people who are there. But there doesn't seem to be any improvement in the apparatus whatsoever. Like, is Jamie Harrison still the chair of the DNC? Does the DNC still exist? It doesn't feel like they're doing anything.
Well, they have undertaken, in the wake of the many Republican state legislatures that are undertaking efforts to restrict access to voting, and with the new Voting Rights Act currently stalled in the Senate, the DNC is undertaking an effort to spin its activities into fighting against those kinds of things in those states. We'll have to see what comes of it. But it is an organization that has, been rendered fairly skeletal and sclerotic due to decades of political fights inside the Democratic Party, as I try and outline in the book. And that's a ship that's not easy to turn around very quickly.
Adam Hilton, assistant professor of politics at Mount Holyoke College. The book is True Blues, The Contentious Transformation of the Democratic Party. Really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sam. I appreciate it.
All right, we're going to put a link to that book at majority.fm. We're going to, we went late there. I just, the structure of the party is fascinating to me in the sense that if there's an opportunity to change our politics, I think on some level, ideologically, the Democratic Party has moved to the left, but it doesn't really mean anything if it doesn't provide, if it doesn't actually deliver upon any of that ideological move. And there's both an opportunity, I think, and a real concern in the fact that there's no apparatus. The lack of the apparatus makes it easier to take over the party. The problem is, once you've taken over the party, what difference does it make if there's no apparatus? It's like we took over the boat, and then we just found out like there's no engine in the boat. There's no sails. All we have is masts. I don't know why I'm stuck on boats right now, but folks, we're going to head into the fun half, and when we do, we're going to be joined by the Thursday crew, and I'm going to even join them for the first 45 minutes just to see what the hell's been going on here. Give me an opportunity to say Happy New Year to Matt Binder. Hello, Matt. How's Doomed? How's the kids?
Hello, Sam. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here with the 10th biggest conservative influencer in the world on this very special January 6th.
Yes.
Let's go, Brandon.
Thank you. Thank you for, acknowledging me.
Yeah, there you go. Let's go, Brandon. How are you, Brandon? Happy
anniversary. Happy anniversary.
Happy 6th anniversary. Yep. We at the Majority Report, of course, like you said, 10th biggest social media conservative influencers. We're keeping it alive. January 6th, still a chance that Trump could get inaugurated. We're just going to try it again in 14 days.
There's been a guy hiding out in the Capitol for a year now. He's somewhere in there, and he's got all the answers. He's never left.
He's sewn himself into like the sofa in Nancy Pelosi's office, and he's just been living in there for the past year.
It's like they were finding Japanese soldiers from World War II on like islands in the Pacific, like 30 years, like into the early 70s, who thought the war was still going on. And there's somebody, Let's take a break and why don't you guys plug what's going on with your shows, and Matt will plug what's happening in the Leckian universe. But then when we get back, I want to ask you guys, like, particularly you, Matt, since you sort of dig around, how did the Majority Report become such an influencer in the conservative media ecosphere? But save that for a second. What's happening on Doomed?
Sure. So this past Tuesday, I did the first stream of the year, and I basically discussed a story very close to me, and that is my family's experience getting COVID. We have COVID. We are COVID positive
right now.
Last I checked, we might not. We're at the cusp now. It's been like day 7 or 8. I can't remember anymore. But the 2-year-old.
Go ahead. Sorry.
The 2-year-old tested positive last week, and then their mom tested positive. I just didn't. Me and the 6-year-old, we didn't get the test because, I mean, it's clear we got it. I mean, why are we going to go out and get a test when we know we have it? We all got sick. We all had symptoms. Luckily, nothing too serious. I did lose my taste and my smell, though, which is a very bizarre experience.
Wow. And did you get it back?
It is coming back. It's not fully back, but certain foods break through, and then certain foods still taste bland.
They say that that Omicron, that's more rare with Omicron, that Delta tends to do that more. So maybe
right.
Delta.
I heard that too, right? But then at the same time, I'm assuming from what I've also heard that Omicron is the less serious of all of them, it seems, and the easiest to spread, and that's why I thought that was the one we possibly got, but maybe we didn't. Because we've been careful for almost 2 years now, and this is the first time we got it. But it is what it is. You can't escape it now. I think everyone will end up really at some point probably getting it. Unfortunately, it seems. Hopefully, the lesser variants than the more serious ones.
Do we know, like, that non-smell thing? I feel like I've experienced that. I'm actually recovering from COVID myself. Had no symptoms like that. But do we know if that happened with other colds or flus? Because I feel like I've had colds where, like, taste has been completely, like, effed up. Not gone, but, like, messed up.
Nothing like this. Food definitely tastes different when you have, like, the flu or you have the cold or something.
Right.
But this is, like, the complete absence of taste. Like,
that's how it was for me too. When I got
bland.
it.
I don't even know if that's even. Yeah, I don't even think bland is the right word for it. Like, it's just like there is no taste. It doesn't taste bad or good. You're just like chewing on something that is tasteless. Like, doesn't matter what it is too. I tried like all different foods of varying, like even like spicy food. And it's like, damn, my mouth feels hot, but I don't taste the spiciness of anything. You know, like there's no taste there. It's weird. But then tonight, 7:30 p.m. Eastern time, youtube.com/Matt Binder. Jared Holt will be on the show, and we will be looking back at basically where the January 6th Capitol stormers go from here and what they've been up to. QAnon, the 3%ers, Proud Boys, just because they're not storming the Capitol anymore doesn't mean they're not still out there, and they are.
Brandon, what's happening on the discourse?
Well, we'll be coming off of holiday break soon. We all took time off well, not me, but the rest of my cohort took time off to see their family. Sorry to hear about your COVID, Matt.
It's all good.
Oh, it's
so
all.
We'll be back on next week.
All right. And Matt Leck, what's happening in the Matt Leckian universe?
Yeah, last night David Griscom and I did a Left Reckoning stream. We talked about Tim Kaine being stuck in snow and what that says about American infrastructure. We talked about Aaron Rodgers reading Atlas Shrugged and why you should not, if you're a young, impressionable, young football fan, you should not read Atlas Shrugged. Why it might have led him down the wrong path when it comes to vaccines. And also we talked about Corey Robbins' take on the Jan 6 stuff and why there's a certain historical perspective that needs that's wanting in certain folks. I think, for instance, the Constitution is going to protect us from something like this, and we talk about that. So patreon.com/Left Reckoning, and that's it.
All right, quick break. Headed into the fun half.
Left is best.
Jamie and I may have a disagreement.
Yeah, you can't just say whatever you want about people just because you're rich.
I have an absolute right to mock them on YouTube.
He's up there buggy whipping like he's the boss.
I am not your employer.
You know, I'm tired of the negativity.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you. You're nervous? You're a little bit upset? You're riled up?
Yeah, maybe you should rethink your defense of that, you fucking idiots.
We're just going to get rid of you.
All right.
But dude. You want to smoke this joint?
Yes.
Do you feel like you are a dinosaur?
Some good shit.
Exactly. I'm happy now.
It's a win-win.
It's a win-win-win.
Oh, hell yeah.
Now listen to me. 2, 3, 4, 5 times. 847-906-501-457. 2, 38, 56, 27. 1/2. 5 8s. 3.9 billion.
Wow.
He's the ultimate math nerd.
Don't you see?
Why don't you get a real job instead of spewing vitriol and hatred, you left-wing Limbaugh?
Everybody's taking their dumb juice today.
Come on, Sammy.
Dance, dance, dance.
Rand Paul.
I had my first post-coital scene with a woman. I'm hoping to add more moves to my repertoire. All I have is the dip and the swirl.
Fine, we can double dip.
Yes, this is a perfect moment.
No.
Wait, what?
You make under $1 million a year. You're scum. You're nothing.
Excuse me? Fuck you, you fucking liberal elite. I think you belong in jail.
Thank you for saying that, Sam. You're a horrible, despicable person.
All right, gonna take a quick break. I want to take a moment to talk to some of the libertarians out there. Take whatever vehicle you want to drive to the library. What you're talking about is jibber jabber.
Classic. I'm feeling more chill already.
Good. Donald Trump can kiss all of our asses.
Hey, Sam. Hey, Andy. You guys ready to do some evil?
Hitler was such an idiot.
I think I might be a Nazi.
Agree.
No.
Death to America.
You.
Yes.
Wow.
Wow, that's weird. No way! Unbelievable. This guy's got a really good hook.
Throw our hands up.
Ooh. Wow.
But Sam, I gotta get off.
No worries. Let's. I want to just flesh this out a little bit. I mean, look, it's a free speech issue. If you don't like me,
Hey, shut up.
Thank you for calling into the Majority Report. Sam will be with you shortly.
we are back, ladies and gentlemen. It is an odd Thursday. Emma's not here, so I am joining the crew, and that's why I got a beard to emulate Matt Binder. So Matt, you have COVID. Your kids have COVID. Let's look at this tweet from Nate Silver. We're talking about teacher unions, and we're talking about basically teachers in San Francisco. Bunch of teachers, not supported by their union necessarily, decided not to go into school. In part, one of the things that's going on is that, I mean, I can tell you, my kid's teacher out with COVID. My kid's principal out with COVID. I would imagine there's his class size now is down to almost like I don't even know if private schools have class sizes this small, but he's got almost 1/3 less the kids in his class right now. He's got 8 kids in his class because people are out with COVID. So much of this is just about the actual functioning of a school. And yet there are people out there who are just insisting that go back to school. Put up this tweet. So Clara Jeffrey, she's I guess she works at Mother Jones. Right. She said a lot of liberal pundit hand-wringing of to the effect of we can close schools now that we know the great harms to kids' mental health, which yes, but is anyone pushing closures that aren't solely prompted by staff shortages due to their own infections? Which is, I think, what we're starting to see. There's a lot of people out with COVID after the holidays. And Nate Silver wrote, suppose you think that school closures were a disastrous invasion of Iraq magnitude or perhaps greater policy decision. Shouldn't that merit some further reflection? What is going on with this dude?
I mean, that's a great question, but, the way it's phrased is, who should be further reflecting if you think that? Perhaps it should be you, the person who thinks that it's a Iraq level magnitude.
Well, she also responded with this point, which is you think this was a policy decision, which, of course, is totally decentralized one. In other words, there's nobody in Washington, D.C. saying the school district in San Francisco, the school district in New York, the school district in Chicago, the school district in Boston should shut. And she says, you think this was a policy decision equivalent to the deaths of 460,000 people? That's I think a contentious number. A lot of people think it's 2 to 3 times that, frankly, from Iraq. Let's just call it 500,000 people and the destabilizing of an entire region. And do you think parents and educators have not been reflecting, for fuck's sake, I think is what FFS means in that in context? This is the thing that's bizarre about it, is that Silver's like comparing this to Iraq for whatever. And he goes, yes, I think depriving tens of millions of school children of an in-person education for a year or longer is absolutely on that magnitude, no question. Now, first off, that happened a year ago. There has been my kid in New York, and you know this, Matt, they've been going full-time to school since September. In fact, my kid since last, April has been going full-time, both my kids.
Oh, right. Besides maybe a few weeks where there were scares in the actual school my son was in, last year he attended almost an entire school year, besides what I just mentioned. This year so far, entire year except for 1 week before the holidays, where again there was a scare in that particular school. In fact, just his class had to stay home because it was just in his class, and the teacher actually ended up getting it, and she had to work remotely from her home because she couldn't go in and teach while she's COVID positive.
This is the bizarre thing that seems to be going on now. It's like that none of these people who are outraged by this are recognizing the fact that there are no lockdowns that exist in this country right now, to my knowledge. There are no complete school closures. What we're seeing is that people are asking for a spot, sort of like temporally narrow capacity for remote learning during like a surge. I mean, to me, it's the equivalent of there's a hurricane going on or a tornado. It's going to rain on either side of this, and I'll send my kid to school in the rain. But if there's a tornado outside, I'm going to keep him home.
The truth is, a lot. I'm not going to say all, but a large portion of these people who are talking about this school closure thing simply have no idea what's going on because they don't even have kids or kids in the public school system or in the school system, any school system. I mean, this is the same thing we saw just a few days ago where conservatives thought they were like owning AOC because she was seen outside at a bar drinking without a mask on, as if you can't do that in New York City. Newsflash to conservatives who don't live in New York City, you can walk around New York City outside without a mask on. You could sit down at an outside establishment and drink a mimosa or whatever the hell you want without a mask on. You don't even need a vaccine passport to do that outside of a restaurant. You only need something when you eat indoors in this city, but they don't know that. They think they owned AOC. So the same thing's happening here. You have people who don't have kids in school talking about how kids must go to school as if there is some sort of nationwide school closure, when again, we're just seeing particular schools. And in some cases, it's even more minute than that, where actual, just like the grade that had the COVID positive student, not even the whole school, is staying home. And that's because the specific school or that specific whatever, the school board, or if it's like a private school, I guess the dioceses or whatever, they make those determinations. No one in federal government.
What's also interesting is that at least in, my kids have friends who have private school. I know people who go to private school. It seems to me that all the private schools, they all planned to be remote this week because they knew everybody was coming back from vacation and they wanted things to settle out. That would have been a great idea too, but there's just a sort of like hysteria about what's going on. And yeah, has it been difficult on kids? Of course. Do I want my kids in school? Yes. In fact, my kids are in school. My daughter's, been in and out over the past week because it's just a crap show where she's going. My son's going in, but it's not like there's much learning going on right now because half the staff is out.
Right. I mean, in my son's school, basically, the teacher is currently posting the schoolwork online, like on Google Classroom, which is something they only did previously when they were fully remote. But the school's open this week, and they're still doing that, which means there must be so many people who are not in the school, even though school is open, that they've made the calculation that, hell, we have to do this as if we were remote because so many kids are just not in right now.
I think what's interesting about.
Go ahead, Brandon. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I think it's what's interesting about all of these people who are hand-wringing about kids in school is that they dance around what they actually want, which is that teachers work sick. Because that's all they can possibly want. Because like we're saying, there's no like coordinated lockdown across states or federal government for like kids to be out of school and remote learning. This is, a staffing shortage that is compounded by years and years of, educational neglect by our state and federal government, now being revealed by the pandemic. And a lot of, liberal pundits and a lot of, liberal parents and just parents across the board have been conditioned to think that schools are a free babysitting service. And maybe that is the role that they provide for a lot of people practically. But in the case of a pandemic, it's time to reassess what that actually means and how feasible that is the way we've structured society. Because like all that, the dancing around Nate Silver is doing it. Well, let's say you do think that it's an Iraq level disaster. Let's say if you are that stupid, like what is your prescription for solving that problem other than having teachers work with COVID in a classrooms that were too densely populated before COVID and have not been properly outfitted with the prerequisite HVAC systems that they were supposed to get, if that would help. Like, what is your actual prescription? But they just want people to make that leap of logic themselves. And in some senses, you would just wish that they would be like, yeah, I want teachers to work sick. I don't think it's that big of a deal. I want them to work sick.
We gotta bomb the teacher's spider hole where they're all hiding in until they come out, and that's when we gotta force them back to go to school. Like this is just ridiculous. Like something you said too about that whole thing about they just want school to be a daycare. The weirdest thing is like there's some really smart people too who I've seen have this bizarre sort of notion too. Like I saw Chris Hayes earlier, someone who I genuinely usually think is on point, but he tweeted one of the absolutely weirdest things about the debate on here is people framing in-person public schooling, probably the most important public good provided by the state, as nothing more than some stalking horse for capitalism, just daycare that exists so parents can work. Well, here's the thing. If teachers are saying they can't do their job because of the current situation they're in, then if you're arguing against them, then you don't really care about the education point of it or even all the other good the schools provide, like a lunch or whatever. If teachers are saying they can't do these very basic things for your children, then you are just someone on the side is, I need somewhere for my kid to go so I could get to work. I mean, it's that simple.
I mean, yeah, I think some of the, the hand-wringing about education and learning loss comes across as being quite like, absent or quite vapid in the sense that like, we've had education problems in America, issues with inequality, issues with funding across the board. But, I think teachers as a class of, as professionals provide a unique way to understand like how the working class is segregated. And a lot of the pandemic has been watching the working class be further segregated into this population that already exists between like, the work from home, work remotely, people who are able to work in these high tech sort of like, I guess the word they use is professional managerial class style jobs, like, tech startups versus the people who prior to the pandemic were in roles that were largely meant to service those jobs, delivery drivers, baristas, bartenders, janitors, people who clean the gym, front desk workers, and of course, obviously teachers who provide that role of like sending your kids somewhere for 8 hours a day so you can perform, your work. And I think for a lot of people who occupy the middle slice of our economic ladder, not the very rich, but the upper middle class, the promise of a permanent servant class of workers teachers is what makes capitalism bearable to them. The idea that, well, yeah, I might not be the CEO of whatever place I work, but I'm not the, I'm not the admin person. I'm not the teacher who takes care of my kids or other people's kids who, we view these jobs, largely speaking, before the pandemic, before they became essential, as jobs that failures did, low-skilled workers. And the idea that these low-skilled workers are now allowed to say no to you because they were deemed essential during the pandemic is, a violation of that, I think, informal contract that people feel like they were able to, that they were able to rely on before the pandemic. Because we know teachers are parents too. A lot of teachers are parents. A lot of people who a lot of people who are saying, oh, well, what am I supposed to do about my job? As though teachers are incapable of having children or families that they care about, are just like unable to see them as anything other than like a service class.
I think there's also people are being very opportunistic in using this as an opportunity to try and demonize teachers' unions.
Yeah, I mean, because they have too much power. They have enough power to tell you how to raise your kids. And that's not something that's allowed in this, even if, the interest in raising the kids in terms of education and like school reform, education reform has not really been there, except for on the far right when they were, marching against critical race theory last week.
Yeah. And it's really funny. Like you actually look at what the studies say about educational attainment, and what they say is that we should be expanding public school into summer school because that's when kids really fall behind. But of course, that's not on the table when you're just trying to attack teachers.
Well, I mean, that was a lot of what that money, I was seeing people respond to Chris Hayes' tweet last night about like, what did we spend all of this money for, the billions of dollars that was allocated to schools that were not for, whatever PPE or HVAC stuff. And someone pointed out that a lot of that money went to sort of those like bridging the gap attainment programs, like summer schools, other types of programs that were not really utilized by a lot of the parents who, travel during the summer or have the option to like take their kids to do something a little bit more fun than summer school and would prefer not to. And so, most people didn't want school for that, didn't want that money for that, even though like that's what educational attainment would speak to. They want it for like the, the 9 to 5, which is understandable for, the kind of society we've structured.
Yep. I don't know. Overall, there's this sort of bizarre sort of quality of like, people want the COVID to be something other than it is. Like people want the pandemic over, and the bottom line is the virus is going to do what the virus is going to do. And
the weirdest thing though is, for the most part though, those people have gotten their way. It's like even the small changes are not enough of it being back to life before. Like for the most part, you can do things in this country now. Like you said, there's no more lockdowns. There's a lot of things that are back to how they were.
Yeah, I think people are just aggravated by the pandemic, and so they're looking. If you're a hammer, everything's a nail, right? And if you're Nate Silver, and you cannot actually say that we can stop COVID, it's then you start looking for any slight, sort of, I don't know, even if you have to create a straw man that exists. And I don't know. I mean, look at Greenwald going on and saying that there's an addiction to the pandemic. I mean, this is just bizarre. I mean, this is beside the point, but I had noticed that he also posted something from a nurse who was quitting, an ICU nurse. And, we've had incredible cuts to hospitals and consolidation over the years. But this is part of the reason why it's not enough to say COVID's not going to kill as many people as it would have before because of the vaccines, is because our hospital systems are breaking. And by saying our hospital systems are breaking, it's not that the stethoscopes are getting worn out. It's that the people are getting worn out. Right. It's that we have already overworked, nurses and doctors who are staffing these things, and they're going to break. They're just going to break as people at one point, because it's been going on 2 years of this, and it's relentless. So
Have you seen those reports from people who work in like nurses and doctors, people who work in hospitals where like they're like quitting or on the verge of quitting because they're now getting blamed by anti-vaxxers' families for the death of their loved ones, for not giving them ivermectin or whatever they think they like, you know, it's only so much human being can take. And that's what they're humans. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. It's really like, what's going on with the school stuff is just like those right wingers who freak out when they see someone choose to wear a mask in a place where it's not mandated. You see that so much now. If someone chooses to wear a mask for their own, because they feel safe or protected or whatever, right wingers will now harass those people in public if they see that, saying, you don't have to wear your mask here, take it off. And it's just like so bizarre. Why do you care? You got your way. It's not being mandated on you. You don't have to wear a mask. Why do you have to cause a problem for the person who chooses to do so? It's because they just want their way all around. It's not just about their own. It's they want everyone else to have to do that too. What were you going to say, Brandon?
I was going to say I was actually surprised and shocked that you didn't wear your mask on stream, even though, you know, we're not in the same room. It would have been polite for you to put your mask on. I didn't want to say anything, but since you brought up masking, I just think it's part that you're just being a hypocrite. But I mean, to Sam's earlier point, I think that, you know, as a country, our media infrastructure up until a point, or media culture rather, up until the point of the pandemic was the kind of system where like we would have a tragedy, a mass shooting, a natural disaster, wildfires, and you know that tragedy would be in the news for about 2 days, maybe 3 max, depending on like the aftermath or the fallout and whether or not it could be, you know, accurately politicized or whatever. But then it would go away. It would be like buried by some other event, you know, for the majority of America, as opposed to, you know, the people who were actually directly impacted. We have like little pockets of the country who have been directly impacted by like natural disasters, from Katrina to Hurricane Maria to, you know, to Sandy Hook, that have just been left devastated by those tragedies that we have as a nation moved on from, because they contradict our story about American exceptionalism and American excellence, because they, you know, they're just anomalous events that happen. I think a lot of people don't like how COVID has just been in the news for the past 2 years, and you're not allowed, and, you know, there are people who follow that account that just tweets about like COVID outbreaks and goes, can you just stop tweeting about COVID outbreaks? It's like, you know, we have enculturated in a large portion of our country the feeling that if a disaster is out of sight, it must have been resolved. And since, you know, we have to like to put, you know, COVID out of sight, for, you know, it's impossible for some people in their minds to pretend like it's resolved.
Yep. It's crazy. I almost got into a physical fight with a guy over break. I was helping a friend who was getting moving cross country, moved the stuff in. The mover wouldn't wear a mask. And we got into a little bit of an argument about it. And he told me that God will take care. The mask is not doing anything. He was a Russian guy. And he told me that that God was going to take care of it. And then I suggested that maybe God would also provide him his tip. So
you got to stick up to those Russians, Sam.
Tipping them anyways, but still, it was like, what kind of effing moron comes in? And we always like, wear your mask inside. What if unbelievable.
I think that goes to like Matt's point. We're dealing with a new wave of like conservative like activism, or rather conservative definition of freedom, that implies that, you know, it's the kind of people who before the pandemic would have, you know, thrown a fit in Starbucks because they didn't say Merry Christmas. The new conservative like performative thing is to be extra virulent, you know, to be extra in your face about how much they don't believe in germs and how much they don't care that you believe in germs. And, you know, Kevin Sorbo is a great example. 2 years ago, he was arguing about them not spelling his name right on the Merry Christmas cup in Starbucks, and now he's arguing about him having to wear a mask in one. And it's just, you know, it's just unfortunate that like that transition was so easy for some people to make, just because it's, you know, one could say that you could treat bigotry like a germ, but now it's become one for a lot of people legitimately, and it's shown a weakness in our society, I think.
Right. They always try to spin it too. Like, if, you know, like, oh, I had COVID and it wasn't a big deal, as if your experience is like anybody else's. I mean, we saw it with Joe Rogan, who constantly downplayed it. And then when he got it, he threw the kitchen sink at it and took as many different, various different medicines as possible. Funny thing is, Joe Rogan, I don't know if you could see, I'm not Brandon or Joe Rogan. I'm kind of scrawny. My kitchen sink was, I can't swallow pills because I'm a baby, but I did take a few chewable Motrin. That was my kitchen sink.
I was going to ask.
Crush them up.
Yeah, Rogan, what, monoclonal antibodies, ivermectin, all this bullshit. I had Dayquil and NyQuil. That's what I did.
I mean, this is me now, Joe Rogan, to you, because you couldn't handle your COVID, I guess, right? Because that's how we determine who's strong or weak, right? Just ridiculous. Their whole worldview is so warped. It's unbelievable.
At one point, I mean, I'm really interested about this. I mean, I know we've seen some graphs that show that, you know, what vaccination rates are, what COVID infection rates are, based upon counties that went, you know, 50% more for Trump or 50% more for Biden. But we've had now, and I would imagine over the course of the next 6 to 8 months, and we're going to have probably 1 million Americans who are going to die. We've had over 800,000 now, could be well over. I would imagine that there are more, you know, Republican voters than Democratic voters who have died. It'd be interesting to see, like, when you're talking about the past 2 presidential elections anyways, we're determined really by 70,000 votes, 40,000 votes. I mean, 110,000 votes, whatever, dispersed over the course of 3 or 4 or 5 states. It's going to be interesting to see if these, if someone is going to do a breakdown of just like who died. And, is that going to change the outcome? Like, you're talking Michigan and Wisconsin, 10,000, 15,000 votes in the Clinton-Trump race. I mean, 1 million people dispersed amongst 50 states. Just doing the math on the back, is 20,000 per state. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see what the implications of this will be.
I can only imagine there are going to be a lot of openings at AM radio shows, though, for
that's correct.
Hosts.
That's correct.
Now, the mortality rate amongst that cohort is pretty high.
Great time to become an AM conservative talk radio show host.
Or terrible time, depending on, your perspective.
A lot of turnover in that business. So if you're a budding conservative AM talk radio host, there's some openings. This is speaking of which, this is sort of shocking to me, but I guess maybe it isn't. Like, look, I've never held Sean Hannity in any esteem. And I've certainly never contemplated that he works at an actual news organization that is anything other than just a propaganda outlet. But there are people who pretend still that the journalism at Fox is journalism. And now it's all been revealed that Sean Hannity was literally like, never mind not covering the presidency, Trump's presidency, but was actively engaged in both not reporting what he knew to be going on in the White House, right? I remember criticizing Bob Woodward for holding back information about the Bush administration for his book. This is a guy who's telling the exact opposite of what's going on in real time, as well as saying stuff like, at one point he texted Mark Meadows, "I'm really worried about the next 48 hours. And those 48 hours were like January 5th and 6th. Like, what was he worried about? Like, maybe there would be some type of, I don't know, riot or insurrection.
Rachel Maddow had a really good show both those nights, and he was worried about his ratings, I think.
Maybe that's what it was. And here he is bringing on his texting buddy, Mark Meadows, to not discuss any of this.
Our foreign adversaries. Don't underestimate the resolve of the American people. We enjoy freedoms 365 days a year while you're celebrating January 6th.
You know something? You condemned January 6th. I have. And I also condemn the 574 other riots with all the damage that I've chronicled on this program, and we'll have a program that's quite different from the rest of the country tomorrow night, considering all the coverage is basically going to be an echo chamber. Mark Meadows, by the way, thank you for being with us. Now, Mark's new book is called The Chief's Chief, Amazon.com, bookstores everywhere, and on Hannity.com. Thank you, sir, for being with us. All right, coming up, you won't believe what the New York's new radical DA is planning for.
I would imagine a lot of coverage will include his text messages, but he's going to do a radical thing and not include them, obviously.
Can you imagine, just for a moment, January 6th, Donald Trump is going to be president. Antifa, or I don't know who Antifa is. There's a bunch of left-wing protesters who storm the Capitol, right? That it comes out a year later that, Rachel Maddow has been texting with Joe Biden's team, with Joe Biden, we can do this. And can you imagine, there would be public hangings by now, right? I mean, there would be show trials, there would be public hangings. I mean, all this, never mind a year later, we're starting to dig into this. This would be, does anybody remember Benghazi? They had 72 hearings for Benghazi. This would have been the biggest thing in the history of this country at this point.
I was just thinking about Benghazi.
I don't recall that one.
I was just thinking about Benghazi because that movie that Jim from The Office made, 13 Hours, I saw a trailer for it, just popped up in my feed. And I was like, Benghazi. I remember that. You couldn't swing a cat without hearing a Republican talk about Benghazi. But to Sam's point, that's what the women's
people died in Benghazi. Incidentally, they were like CIA agents. 4 people died in Benghazi. We heard it over and over. 5 people died in the Capitol because of because Donald Trump was saying, go down there and go in there.
I hate to sound like a hypocrite, but I think that's what Hillary Clinton should have turned the Women's March into. Honestly, I think that during, when the Women's March happened with the pink hats and everything, they should have just stormed the Capitol. A lot more people there. If anyone has enough experience at coups, it's definitely Hillary Clinton.
Charlie Daniels' Twitter account still tweets every day, Benghazi ain't going away, and it's been 2 years since he died. They have it set up so it continues to tweet Benghazi ain't going away. Yeah, every day
him, I guess.
It says, yeah,
that's amazing. Can we pull up Charlie Daniels' thing?
I'll send it to you right now. I had to check to make sure I was still doing it, and they do it every day. When did he die again?
Unbelievable.
It's only funny if it tags Hillary Clinton in it, though.
He died July 2020, so it's going to be 2 years of him tweeting this every day while he's dead.
Keeping Charlie's legacy alive. Benghazi ain't going away. That is very bad news for Charlie Daniels and Charlie Daniels' legacy. Benghazi went away.
You got to imagine that one day, ideally in the future, maybe not humans, but some intelligent species might find that and, just not understand. But it will outlive the human race, ideally.
Oh, they'll get Devil, Devil went down to Georgia, but they will not get the Benghazi reference. All right. Well, guys, I'm going to jump off and leave this show in your hands. I've got to run and do. I've got some issues that I've got to deal with. So I will leave you guys to it. Happy New Year to both of you. And
Happy New Year.
I will be back tomorrow. Let's see. How do I leave this?
Not Sam's going to talk about him. Oh, he's not How are you feeling?
Did you catch that episode of the Majority with Sam Seder where they literally just were talking shit about Sam Seder? What a weird show that was.
I think a lot of people
I'm doing all right. I'm doing all right. Yeah.
When I lost my I had coronavirus OG. I don't want to call myself an old head, but I am. And so when I lost my sense of smell, I didn't even notice for a while because there was like usually like Matt was saying, when you like your sense of smell or taste is messed up by like the flu or whatever, it's like mucus or whatever. But like my nose wasn't stuffy. I just like didn't have a sense of smell. It was just gone. And it took me a while to realize it. So I can appreciate your, struggle.
Oh, that was like the first thing I was waiting for. Like, that's why I didn't think I had it. I thought I was just had like a regular cold or whatever for a couple of days. And then the taste went away. The same day my 2-year-old tested positive because she had a cough. So we took her in because that's what you do with young children when they have a bad cough, because that could be much worse for kids than, adults. And then so I was like, oh, and then I started losing my taste and my smell that very day. And I was like, oh, so I definitely got it then. Like I didn't get tested, but I drove for 5 hours home from DC because after Christmas we went to DC and I wasn't sick. And then that last day we're at DC, the day we drove home, I started feeling sick. And then I was like, oh, but then I was like, yeah, no one else is sick and it's not that bad. Just coughing and sneezing a lot, but oh well, I got COVID.
Womp womp.
So do you want to do this clip of Ron DeSantis? Because I think it's funny.
Oh, sure. I mean, I'm glad he surfaced because he was gone there for a little bit, wasn't he?
Yeah. Speaking of COVID, there's been a rumor where he's been out not a rumor that he's been out, but a rumor that he had COVID or has COVID because he, for the whole 2 weeks of that holiday season, he was MIA. And then when he finally did resurface, people were pointing out that he sort of seemed a little bit sick, like he was out of breath while he was talking. Now, I'm not going to speculate. I did watch the video and he did, he did seem not his usual self, but who knows why?
I mean, I just thought he had dipped because of how embarrassing it was that his press secretary, who he hired to tweet COVID misinformation, had the week before tweeted out that every other place in America is blooming with COVID, but Florida's fine. And then the week after, what everyone expected to happen happened. What I just find is kind of not weird, but annoying is that we find ourselves trapped in this cycle with Republicans like that, where they just make light of things that are horrific for as long as it's not affecting them, and then the moment it starts affecting them, it becomes well, it's no time for jokes because now real people have it, and you're like, okay, so we end up in this cycle of, with Florida, for example, of Florida talking shit every 2 weeks while their cases are down because the fatality rate is so high. And then when it's blooming, we are unable to contextualize it, or rather they call for us not to contextualize any other sort of tragedy gun violence. They call for us not to contextualize because it's not the right time. And so the only time you hear about it is when they're doing well.
Yeah, and they're all solemn pro-vaccine folks now, right? Because it's the vaccine, take the vaccine, and it's over. DeSantis put up "Don't Fauci my Florida" merchandise, right, with a syringe on it. But now that's my favorite move of the COVID isn't, or we overreacted to COVID thing. Is previously it was hey, don't be authoritarian with the vaccine. Now it's hey, we got the vaccine, we can send people to school. It doesn't matter if hospitals in Utah can't staff beds, right?
Whatever it takes to keep that economy running.
Yep. Right. So Ron DeSantis, on top of being terrible when it comes to COVID-19, he went out there today and he was, I guess, asked. I guess that's how it came up about January 6th, because that is today the anniversary of the pro-Trump mob that stormed the Capitol and tried to get Vice President Mike Pence to somehow change the election results because of their bizarre understanding of the rules of the law in this country, and reinstate Donald Trump as president. And when they didn't get their way, they obviously were very unhappy. But here is Ron DeSantis on January 6th talking about the 1-year anniversary today.
So I think it's going to end up being just a politicized Charlie Foxtrot today. I don't expect anything.
What else can January 6th be but politicized? How can you do the don't politicize January 6th? It was literally an event that saw pro-Trump supporters storm the Capitol building in an attempt to overturn the election results and reinstate Donald Trump as president for another 4 years, which they were aided, by the way, these weren't just, the everyday pro-Trump supporters, like your average citizen, aided by members of the House and Senate who were also trying to call into question the completely legitimate 2020 presidential election results, who were trying to overturn it themselves via throwing out actual legitimate votes from Democrats. How else is this not a politicized event? Was this a nonpartisan thing where you saw both parties storm the Capitol because everyone just loved Donald Trump? So I'm trying to understand how this is not a politicized event from the get-go.
Well, it can't be political because it implicates them poorly.
Right. So let's hear about this again. God, I can't believe those Dems politicizing January 6th.
So I think it's going to end up being just a politicized Charlie Foxtrot today. I don't expect anything good to come out of anything that Pelosi and the gang are doing. I don't expect anything from the corporate press to be enlightening. I think it's going to be nauseating, quite frankly, and I'm not going to do it. But I do think that if you have this January 6th committee, why do we not know some of the people who we know were really involved in orchestrating this? They got pulled off the most wanted list. Christopher Wray was asked at the under oath what FBI was involved in that, and he would not answer the question. And so I think that this is something that has really been used for political narrative and posturing purposes.
What he's doing there is Ron DeSantis is spreading this right-wing conspiracy theory, because there's been viral videos showing specifically one particular individual the night before who was at the event. Because remember, January 6th was actually a 2-day event. They threw on, in order to try to separate themselves to the more fringe members like Roger Stone and Alex Jones, they held a January 4th night rally in DC. And they put all those fringe people there speaking at that one. And I'm sorry, January 5th night rally, I should say. And they put all the fringe people there. And there's a video from that night of this very tall Donald Trump supporter yelling that how tomorrow we should all go storm the Capitol. And to them, this is their proof that this guy was an FBI plant who had intended to rile up the crowd, and that's why they stormed the Capitol, because of this one viral video where he said this to about a dozen people. That's what caused thousands of Trump supporters to fly down to DC in a matter of hours, apparently, as if this wasn't something planned beforehand for weeks and months. But I don't know why that. I can't tell you why that guy. I do know that guy is not an FBI plant because he has been investigated by journalists and reporters who found him to be an actual individual who is not, not employed by the FBI, as far as we know, I guess, if they want to throw that out there. But he has a long history of supporting Donald Trump. So maybe he is giving them information based on what he knew there or whatever. But he certainly didn't go down there as an FBI informant because he went down there as a Trump supporter. But, this whole idea that these guys are trying to downplay it when they were cheering this stuff on. Now, I don't know if Ron DeSantis himself was, but we've seen this for so many. I mean, my favorite is that Ben Garrison comic, the day of January 6th, where, or the day after, where he basically drew this giant Trump supporter ripping off the Capitol, the top of the Capitol building, yelling at like Mike Pence, Mitch McConnell, and Nancy Pelosi, "Do you hear us now?" with the MAGA hat. And then a few days later, his comic was basically showing that it was all an FBI thing and that all the people storming the Capitol were all FBI agents. Like, it's amazing how these guys completely changed their tune on it once they realized what the public perception of the event was. I mean, that same night we saw people try to spin it as you had Kevin Sorbo basically cheering on, "The Patriots have entered the Capitol. The Patriots are in Nancy Pelosi's office." And then the last tweet about it that night is Antifa went down to the Capitol posing as true patriotic Trump supporters. It's amazing how quickly they changed their tune based on how the public ended up perceiving this.
Yeah, I mean, that's anecdotally, like I heard from family in North Dakota that that's what they were hearing. That was going around their workplaces was Antifa, like later in the day. And it is because, and I think North Dakota might be a weird place because it's definitely Trumpy, but like they have some sort of independent thing. So what I heard was, and this doesn't bear with polling, which shows Trump basically maintained his popularity through Jan 6th. But I heard that a lot of people in North Dakota, at least, and I'd be curious what other people in red areas, if they notice this, they had their Trump signs up until Jan 6th, but once the storm of the Capitol happened, they took it down. And like maybe that won't be the MAGA people, but like the sort of independent conservatives that were sort of on board that train, I think did get off. And that's why you are seeing the different stories. First it was Antifa and now it's the FBI. Like is Antifa working with the FBI now? I wonder what's going on there. But
right, we all know the FBI has a long history of teaming up with the left and not the right in this country. Right. Of course. Of course.
That's why you can't trust right wing. I mean, honestly, that's why you shouldn't fuck with the right wing, because they'll just deny that you exist afterwards. And it's funny in that sense, but it's also very sad because all we hear about is the left turning on each other. But the moment, you know, a right winger gets clapped by the police, they have that little 2 buttons in their head that go like, believe the police, you know, love the right. And, you know, they just always instinctually go with the police, even when it inconveniences them. I think ultimately, though, it's an interesting kind of, I don't want to say human centipede, but I'm going to say human centipede because I can't think of another analogy for when like things along a line become progressively worse. I'm sure there's probably a better one. I think a lot of it has to do with this kind of implicit promise that right-wing demagogues who have been, you know, I don't want to say normalized, but more integrated into our media system kind of, you know, portray themselves as being able to, you know, we make our money, we have our clout by stoking up a base of people to the point in which they might commit violence, they might commit, you know, interpersonal acts of violence, interpersonal acts of political violence. But generally, we have the ability to rein them in, the moment things go too far. And we have the ability at any moment to like rein them in, to control them in a way that is, never going to result in something that goes out of control, which obviously January 6th, it probably did in some of their minds, but that kind of control was always an illusion. And in many ways, like, we see that on the Democrat side when it comes to the parties and, population to their right as well, thinking that, okay, well, Republicans are never playing ball. They don't play ball now, but one day, maybe, at least what they present to like the Democratic voters, one day maybe when things really matter, like climate change or perhaps a pandemic, the Republican Party will be able to be made to get on board immediately. And all of like the structures and years of context that have been enabling, have been like the sort of center right and more established right enabling their far right base, and like the center left and more established Democratic Party enabling the Republican Party enabling their base. It's all built on this like very flimsy premise that like it won't ever be going too far to stop, like not on a dime, but if things really, really matter, like we can all get together like we did after 9/11. And then after 9/11 we didn't get together, obviously, and we still can't.
Right. Yeah, it's incredible to watch. And by the way, one thing I do agree with. He later on, rare that I agree with something he says, but not for the same reason. Ron DeSantis brings up later on in that same speech how there's people who compare this to 9/11, and obviously anyone who's comparing January 6th to 9/11, I think, is completely off base. And yes, you have some of those people who tend to be, liberals or Democrats, not really, you don't see any leftists doing that.
I mean, Claire McCaskill said that she like watched Jan 6 coverage on 4th of July with her family.
Yeah, I mean, that's just ridiculous. That's ridiculous. There are obviously people who are over dramatizing the situation. Yet at the same time, the right wants to completely downplay it. Like there's a way to completely look at this in reality as a realistic fashion where, there was a violent crowd of pro-Trump supporters who tried to overturn the presidential election results. They were very disorganized, but that doesn't mean they didn't have people within them who had some very violent and serious thoughts and we're planning on acting upon them. And we also know that there was people on the inside, like the president himself at the time, Donald Trump, who supported it and wanted to happen and wanted to see how far it would go before he was basically forced to step in. We know. I mean, it was always obvious that he was sitting in his room in the White House or whatever, eyes fixated on the TV, watching it all go down, like
ignoring texts from his son.
Right. But we now know for sure, based on evidence that's been released from people in his orbit who have basically said, hey, we're trying to get the president to do something, but he's too busy watching the coverage on television. I mean, it is exactly what it is. It's nothing more. You don't have to try to make it out to be some sort of terrorist attack that took thousands and thousands and thousands of lives and instituted a insane surveillance system in this country that has forever changed how the country acts, even the most basic, like at the airport or whatever, like 9/11 forever changed. But we also don't need to downplay it as if nothing happened. In my estimation, the worst of it is that we see that basically they'll physically go down there and do something like this, and nothing will change, which basically lit the fire under actual state houses, Republicans who control state houses' asses to actually say, hey, they won't do anything when people physically attack a federal building and try to overturn the election. Hell, let's change the actual like voting laws and election laws to make this more favorable for us. Who's going to stop us? No one. I mean, that's what we're seeing now. And I think that's the real danger of what we saw from January 6th, that it emboldened the right to basically say there will be no consequences for anything we do. So let's just fucking go for it.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with that. And I also think at its core, it's demonstrative of a dynamic that we have, in terms of political media and political organizing in this country that is inherently problematic and that we're seeing play out still with the pandemic. And that's that we have a core of, disinformation merchants ranging from established Fox News and, I guess OAAN or whatever they call themselves now, channels to like YouTube commentators on the far right that prior to the pandemic, even prior to January 6th, have been allowed to, and a lot of people across the political spectrum have been allowed to like just treat punditry as though it's the same thing as political journalism. And what we see in January 6th is that, they have the ability to mobilize or at least convince large portions of the American population of a reality that simply does not exist. And we're seeing that play out with the vaccine skepticism, the anti-vaxxer sentiment, all of these various levels. And we saw it play out before that with, various conspiracy theories that took control of the right over time, like Obama being a Kenyan Muslim. And, you can look at January 6th as a funny event, but it's impossible, I think, to disaggregate it from the fact that, we've more or less given up the ability as a society to control whether or not factual information is discernible from fictional information, as long as the people who are peddling that information go through various hoops. And their ability to influence large portions of the country to do things that are antisocial is less important than the ability for them to monetize their right to freedom of speech in a way that's entirely incapable of being, separated from just general news. And I mean, January 6th, funny, not funny, large swaths of the America not being able, like not getting vaccinated, not believing in vaccinations, funny, not funny, believing Obama's not American, funny, not funny. It depends. At the core, our inability as a society to like have people believe facts is a very troubling thing that we've kind of just seeded since the 90s when the fairness doctrine was just like, kicked away by the Clintons. And so like, I think it's, people want to look at January 6th as a anomalous event that occurred in the sense that like, usually Republicans and like Republican adjacent right wingers don't storm the Capitol and kill a bunch of political, police, and maybe they never will again. But the sort of the context that exists within is that there are still millions and tens of millions of Republicans who can be convinced by, Fox News or OAN or like Steven Crowder that germs aren't real, that they should infect other people, that racism isn't real, that these like larger problems are part of the same bucket. And like, people just don't want to acknowledge how far we've ceded that ground to like, well, our political media can just be competing narratives and people can live in that world. And you can monetize misinformation and you can monetize correcting misinformation, but the overall problem can never be solved.
Right. There were a lot of funny things, obviously, from January 6th. I think that's completely fair to mention. But yeah, to completely, undermine the idea that there was. I mean, I'm assuming like we look at history where, obviously it's in the past, so we look at it from that perspective. But you don't think like within every single like major event throughout history, there were like aspects that people at the time found funny that maybe even got lost through in history or something. Like, it's not like everyone was like always 24/7 serious when some sort of national event was happening. I'm sure there were funny aspects of almost everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think like generally, and we'll get this in the next clip. I don't have a lot of faith in the Democrats pulling like accountability off. But I think the idea of it is nice. I like the idea of using politics. I think there should be an investigation onto this, even if it's not a huge political winner. But it's also like, I would prefer we had a good realization of what happened with the what do they call it, the Brooks Brothers riot, more than Jan 6, because like that one actually worked and actually like that was actually a lawfare coup that it was a similar sort of strategy, just with some guys that ended up being like on the Supreme Court. I think Kavanaugh was there, right? And maybe even Gorsuch.
Right.
And like that's and so like that's why I like the Corey Robin piece in Politico, because it's like, I think January 6th is serious, but only in the context of like a broader attack on, like, decades long attack on popular democracy.
Right. And also I want to point out, and I have no qualms of saying this, it is absolutely not the actions that happened. It's who did these actions and for what reason.
Right.
Like, people keep bringing up like, oh, if these wouldn't be left-wing protests. I mean, I can say I wish it was, and they were fighting for something meaningful, especially during a pandemic. Like, it would be great if enough people who are progressives got together and decided to really instill fear in politicians to actually take care of the American people with both monetary, healthcare, all sorts of different programs that can help people who are truly struggling right now. I would love for the left to instill fear in our elected officials to actually do something to help people. But what happened January 6th was a bunch of really small business owners for the most part. Sure, there were some working class people who got duped into this or were true believers and didn't need to get duped. But the vast majority, we know now, were people who were making like 6 figures a year and just loved Donald Trump and how he treated minority groups and the disaffected like shit. And they thought it was hilarious and great. And they loved that it was all about them, those people making 6 figures and their tax cuts and everything. And that's what I think is the real danger, that they wanted to overturn election results to basically help themselves and people who are much more rich and wealthy.
Yeah.
If this was an actual uprising of the working class
against a stolen election.
Right. Then I would be all for it.
Yeah, I don't know that I'd be there because I'd expect to get shot.
Right.
But I would, yeah, absolutely. Like, that's the thing. Is like, to the extent that there were true believers that actually thought the election was stolen by Trump and went to Jan 6, like, I don't know, the woman who like got killed or whatever. If she genuinely believed that, she was killed by those lies. Like that, that's what she was killed by, because like that's what happens. Those are the stakes when you storm a fucking Capitol building, like, right? Like, you have to expect stuff like that. But also like, and so the problem is with the line, and that stuff does need to, that you do need to extract a political price about for the Republicans for their continued fealty to that lie, because all the people that didn't want to certify are still not saying that Trump wasn't the rightful winner of that election.
Right.
Yeah, no, I mean, definitely, there's no issue with calling it a systemic failure, because it's obviously a systemic failure. The question of true believers versus like who there was a true believer, is always the question we find ourselves in when we talk about these like far right rallies, going back to the march on, what was the one in Charlottesville, what they called the March for Freedom of Speech or whatever what was called.
Unite the Right.
Unite the Right. All of these rallies, as people who study neo-fascism will tell you, like, I'm sure there are plenty of people who are there who have been misinformed about like, oh, I like freedom of speech. We have an entire culture that teaches people to fetishize certain ideas in very shallow ways that, actual core of either far right, neo-Nazis can manipulate, or as we've seen with various news outlets, people who just have no problem monetizing the ideas and the cultural grievances of people who are aligned with far right, ideology, will just feed into. And we've, like I said, we've largely ceded our ability to do anything about that core of people who like have monetized misinformation. And so, really the question of what is to be done about all these people that the system has failed because, too many people make money off of the system failing for it to be corrected is a question that we're asking ourselves about every single part of our society. And so, I just think that we shouldn't privilege these people as the one true like group of people who are deserving of the system succeeding for them. And I think that's what we see a lot. Like people wonder, as they are sentenced to jail in one of our many terrible, terrible prisons, like if this is fair given what they did. And it's just like, in the context of America, probably in the context of what is like we should expect for ourselves and hope for ourselves, no. But to like pretend as though it's uniquely unfair to them is, I think, what people want. They want to be able to elevate the plight of far right small business owners as the true Americans, this kind of like, neo noble savage construct. Like, they're the new noble savage. They're like your mud farmers from Tennessee who can't know no better. And, if you feel that way, the question of like, why don't we do something about the people who misinform them is like, well, because, they make money doing it and that's freedom of speech. And so like, if people have ceded the ability for us to like, correct misinformation in any real way, then I guess all we can do is allow for these people to fall through the cracks. I think that's just the reality of it.
Right. Let's get to some IMs, then we'll take a call or two. Right? I just realized we didn't take any calls today.
Well,
Sam being here
hear about that.
Leaving.
Can we do a different kind of on this subject, but from the Democrat side of things on Jan 6th?
Let's do that. Is there a clip?
So we have a clip of Nancy Pelosi and Lin-Manuel Miranda.
Oh my God! What?
Yeah. So
what a power.
There's a phrase I think people may have heard it. That dog won't hunt, and it's sort of like the Democrats, there are things that they should do, like accountability for Jan 6. Are they going to be able to do it? I mean, I hope so. Good luck to most accountability as possible. But these sorts of things don't inspire confidence.
To begin the conversation, we're privileged to have a contribution from one of the great creative talents of our time, Lin-Manuel Miranda.
Oh.
May his beautiful words be an inspiration to us. Among the words he said and in the music, we'll make it right for you. If we lay a strong enough foundation, we'll pass it on to you and we'll give the world to you. Lin-Manuel and his father and the Hamilton singers whom we'll hear from said that they were all very honored to be asked to participate today. I call your attention to...
A new year brings hope for the future, new energy to face the tasks ahead of us, and a renewed promise to strengthen the foundations of our democracy. We are all stewards of the American experiment, working to pass down to our children and our grandchildren a more perfect union that treats all its citizens with fairness and equity. We should never take our rights and liberties for granted, and we must remain committed to finding a way forward together. That's what I wrote about in the song Dear Theodosia from Hamilton. I believe no challenge is worth abandoning our efforts to unite as Americans. We'll keep working, generation after generation, until we reach that someday.
Oh my God. High in the sky.
Oh my God.
Dear Theodosia, what to say to you? You have my eyes, you have your mother's name. When you came into the world, you cried, and it broke my heart. I'm dedicated.
Why do talented people have to be so corny? Like, why can't those talents be bestowed upon non-corny people? Like, they're good singers, those guys, obviously. Why they got to do something so corny?
It's like that guy who paints those like really super realistic like oil paintings of Trump like holding the flag and looking confused. It's like, well, with that talent, you can do some like fruit or something. Like
right.
You do some like, kind of like recreate some Bob Ross painting or something in your free time.
Right. I mean, that's also, I guess, why they are corny liberals, I guess, because we know that in order to become a conservative, 99% of them are just not talented at anything. So they go into conservative commentary because they got nothing else to do.
Yeah.
See Ben Shapiro wanting to be a screenwriter, and every other conservative who wanted some sort of Hollywood dream life to come true and ended up not even getting booked for a single role, and then fell into basically talking about how really though Hollywood elites are all eating babies. So that's why I didn't want to be part of Hollywood.
Yeah.
Not because I have no talent.
Lin-Manuel's stuff is so whack. I mean, the whole, like the quote that Pelosi read off in the before she threw to the video, it was like, pass it on, we can pass it on to you if we lay a strong enough foundation, we can pass you on the world. So like, just, okay, inheritance. So we're talking about people who like love the concept of like inheritance, and they really believe in that. And it's like, oh, also his dad is really like happy to be part of this too. It's like, oh yeah, that's because his dad is a State Department guy. So I think we're understanding a little bit of the buy-in. And like, I always thought it was weird that Democratic politicians were talking about, and I know it was a big thing regardless of like the buy-in from like 2016 election year stuff, but it always seemed like, honestly, like this is like, if the Democrats didn't pay for part of this, like the catering or something, they could have. But anyway, I digress. I'm not a fan of Lin-Manuel, but we do have another clip just to kind of show off his.
I will say his songs in Moana are good. So basically, if he's creating something for a production that he didn't write, he's not the creative force behind.
Okay.
He can put together good songs, because the Moana songs are good, but he had to work off of the story that was written by someone other than him.
People get mad when I comment on the quality of Lin-Manuel Miranda's work, and so I'll take a pass on this one. I just want to applaud the Democrats for finding something almost as unbearable as like watching a bunch of like QAnon people storm the Capitol to do like the year after. Just like the collective trauma just keeps compounding, I suppose.
Can we play this clip of him freestyling?
Oh my God, do we have to?
Yeah, we do.
Oh my God.
I'm past patiently waiting, I'm passionately smashing every expectation, every action's an act of creation.
Oh my, what?
That's not freestyling. That's like not even.
That was actually that was the lyrics from, I think, Hamilton, actually, and he was just.
I don't remember
off the dome.
I don't
it's called bars, son.
It is not called bars, son. I do not even remember any of the songs from Hamilton. I always say that, and people get mad at me, but it's like they're so forgettable and so poorly executed that it's like hard to like even understand them. Even if it's hard to understand them in that sense.
Oh, someone in the YouTube chat just reminded me. He also wrote the song. He also wrote the songs for that new Disney movie, Encanto. And the funny thing about that is that all the people who like that movie, like the Disney fans like that movie, there's this meme online where they make fun of the fact that like they asked him to write the music and then made sure he didn't play any of the characters, even this one character that he obviously definitely wanted to play, but they gave John Leguizamo the role instead.
Great decision.
Awesome.
Yes.
Yeah. I saw a John Leguizamo production of Othello presented as a hip opera, and let me tell you, it was infinitely better than Hamilton. And
where, Brandon?
Was that
where was that?
In New York somewhere? I mean, there's like a trillion cities. There's like a trillion theaters here. It was like years ago.
That's
like,
amazing.
6 years ago in like an off-Broadway theater. It was like really tiny theater, and it was like at the end of their run, and it was like maybe 6 other people in there, but it was great.
I used to love The Pest when I was like 8.
Very minimal set. I love John Leguizamo's productions.
Yeah, he's good. He's Luigi in the Super Mario Brothers movie.
Well, he should be Luigi in the new one, or maybe he should be Mario. They should have upgraded.
He should be Mario. Why do we get what's his face? Oh my God, it's gonna be so bad. Chris Pratt. Oh my God. And they've already said they're not even gonna try to do the Mario voice we all know. Like it's a completely different take of Mario. You know, it's not gonna be it's a me, Mario. It's not gonna be that at all. They're gonna just let Chris Pratt be Chris Pratt. Yeah.
Italophobia. Italophobia.
Chris Pratt. What part? Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Chris Pratt was like Hollywood's last attempt to make like a new leading man who people could like want in movies, and he just kind of like didn't take off. He was like fine in Guardians of the Galaxy, and then like he did that Passengers movie where he like wakes up Jennifer Lawrence or something to like be his girlfriend, and then like I don't know what else he's done since then.
All right, let me grab a call or two. Right, you guys got time for a call or two? So
I got time. I don't want to hear. I don't want to hear people go like, "Oh, they don't take calls in majority report." Even though I'm only here like once a week.
Right. Oh wait, someone said champagne commie in the that's a few IMs too. The jokes must have been lit during the Boston Tea Party. I mean, let's put it this way. If you think there wasn't some guy who attempted to throw the barrel, the barrel off the boat, and he slipped and busted his ass on that during the Boston Tea Party, that definitely happened. And everyone there stopped for a minute and started laughing at that guy. I guarantee you.
If memory serves, they dressed up as Native Americans. So the whole thing was a bit, basically.
Someone definitely.
Yeah, there you go.
Someone definitely took one of the boxes of tea and just threw it into the ocean and said, like, "That's the tea, son," and everyone laughed.
I mean, it's literally a joke, right? Like, we did a tea party because we threw the tea in the water. Like, the whole thing is actually like.
One of the funny things about like people who don't study like a lot of history is that they think everyone in the past is humorless, and so occasionally you'll find out that like the translation of something from like hundreds of years ago was like a joke, or like a pun. They'll go, "Oh, haha, that's funny."
Yeah, there's a lot of Ben Franklin stuff like that, like stuff that the quotes that people just took him as like absolutely serious, and like that's a bit contradictory. He's like, "Yeah, I'm fucking joking, you idiots."
Right, as if they didn't have like sarcasm and like witty assholes back then. Like, that definitely was the case. Yeah, irony, of course.
Irony, right. Like years out, like
there were definitely irony bros back then. Absolutely right.
Yeah.
Let's go to 219. What's your name? Where are you calling from? 219.
Oh, is this me?
That's you. You got to speak up a little bit in your phone. You're kind of low.
Oh, how about now?
That's better. What's your name? Where you from? And what would you like to talk about?
This is Nathan from the Chicagoland area. I've talked to you before on Doom before for a similar reason I'm going to bring up. Professional wrestling, since yesterday had a mass release again.
Oh, right. I saw that.
Which I think kind of applies to like what the majority report kind of stands for, because the whole reason like the WWE terrible business practices multiple times over, like the first off practice to try to like make other companies that wanted to start up starving them of talent by like throwing them on huge contracts, to later release multiple people, over 70 wrestlers in the last year. And then we had a couple more last night, which kind of a shitty business practice is just like, I mean, it's just basic capitalism in general to try to like starve competition, try to hold on to a monopoly that's been built in that was kind of inherited over time. I wanted to call in to talk shit about Vince McMahon.
Oh, yeah, sure.
I want to say I'm not.
And then on the other end, you have the.
What were you saying, Brandon?
Sorry about that. I'm a little bit nervous bringing it up.
No, don't worry about it. No, I mean, listen. Here's the deal.
Oh,
like you mentioned. Like, here's the thing too. Like WWE hires people, talent, makes them sign contracts as independent contractors, and then controls basically everything they're able to do. They can't wrestle for any other companies. Any media they do, they need to run it through the WWE first. On top of that, any sort of outside income
like
they
Twitch,
make,
for example.
Yes, if they do, this was a big issue last year.
Like, for example,
right, with Twitch.
Like during the pandemic time.
Right. There were a number of wrestlers. There were a number of wrestlers who had Twitch channels making them a decent side income, and WWE made them shut it down because they were apparently not allowed to use their wrestling name or whatever to promote their side project because the WWE owns their wrestling name. But when it comes time for the WWE to clean house and save money or just not pay people anymore or release people, they can relinquish that contract just like that. Doesn't matter. There are people who literally signed contracts just a few months ago who get fired months later, even though their contract was for like 2 or 3 years, and that they couldn't end it 2 or 3 years
and force them not to be able to work for 90 days.
Right. They can't end those. The talent can't end those 2 to 3 year contracts, but WWE surely can whenever they'd like. And then on top of that, like you mentioned, have clauses in there that say they can't wrestle or work anywhere else for 90 days, which, yeah, WWE still pays them their base salary during that time, but it also greatly hurts their influence because with 3 months down the road, it's a long time. People could possibly not remember who you are during that whole time period. You lose that cachet of being a former WWE talent who was just on TV last week, for example. And going to another company and using that to your advantage. So yeah, without a doubt, WWE has taken liberties here, especially during the pandemic. I mean, obviously the independent contractor situation has been an issue for a long time, but during the pandemic, they basically released all this talent that they were just holding to starve the competition because there's a new really big wrestling company that's basically giving them the first run for their money since when WCW closed down
All Elite
in 2000. Yeah.
So it's like it's been an attempt to starve competition like on a global scale and local scale. Like local scale, the people that got released yesterday were part of NXT, which was the brand they made to kind of simulate I'm going to a local show with about 300, 400 people there, kind of like that intimate atmosphere. It was WWE looking at like independence and be like, we can pretend, we can simulate an independent experience. They've tried to create, they made a term for it, like global local marketing of some sort. Like in England, they would starve their like small time independent territory to create their UK brand that wants to compete with ITV was starting the world of sport.
Why don't you call into my show tonight and we could talk more about this, because this is definitely a topic that I'm very interested in, but I think gotta move it a little bit faster on this show. So my show tonight. If
I love to. Last time I tried, you got inundated with just a bunch of Bitcoin conversation, which was the last time we had a mass release like a couple of weeks ago.
I will make sure that I take your call tonight. Just Doomed Live on Skype. I'll probably take calls tonight around, 8:30, 9 o'clock. So definitely, I'll take your call.
Sounds wonderful.
What were you going to say, Brandon?
I was going to say, I haven't watched wrestling since like the early 2000s, but like last night, I saw that they released William Regal, and that just like threw me back in time. And I was like, holy shit, William Regal. I remember when he first started wrestling in like the WWF then, I guess, or E. And I was like, wow, I haven't watched wrestling in a long time.
Yeah, he was with the company for over 20 years, and they released him yesterday. And the funny thing is, it was either earlier this year or last year. Triple H, who is a wrestler and also Vince McMahon's son-in-law, he was the guy running that pseudo independent wrestling company under WWE that the caller mentioned, NXT, and he basically was giving all these indie talents a chance at like the big stage on WWE television for the first time. And basically Triple H had, I believe, a heart attack or something, and has been out of work at work for months. And during that time, Vince McMahon basically took over NXT, and
Shawn Michaels has been replacing him.
Yeah, and released everybody who Triple H had entrusted in running the company, the NXT for him. And he basically said just earlier this year something that William Regal had a job with the company for as long as William Regal wanted. And then they fired him yesterday. But thanks for the call. Looking forward to talking to you tonight more about this.
Very much appreciate it. Have a good night.
Take care.
Have a good day. Have a good overall experience.
Will do. Let's take one more call, I think. And then 701. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hey guys, my name is Ryan. I'm calling from North Dakota.
Hey Ryan from North Dakota. What would you like to talk about?
Well, I was actually just some news came out that California's single payer program, they have they're trying to pursue that in some way, and they just released the funding proposal for it, and it just got me thinking. I'd like to ask you guys, because a lot of made is how federally the Democrats are really failing, to provide society with these welfare supports that they have in most other, advanced and rich nations. But state Democrats, I think we should focus more on them because, they're failing too, right? Like California, New York, Massachusetts, these are big states with like a lot of, they got like a lot of money they could work with, but they're not, paid leave, child care programs. some form of universal health care, even for like something like kids, or when it costs that much, they're not doing. So what I want to ask you guys is, if you like had control of the state legislature, you had some say, what is the one issue where you would have the state government really go after?
Matt, Brandon, you have anything off the top of your head? I got to think about this one.
I would ban cars.
I mean, that's a
good luck winning, but I agree.
And he said if I was already in control, I would assume I'd be ruling with an iron fist by this point. So I would ban cars and, put in real public transportation infrastructure.
It's funny. It's funny you say that because it's not the same exact thing, but I just saw, the new Brooklyn borough president. His name escapes me at the moment. But basically, like for the past,
Antonio
Reynoso, basically for like the past, I don't know how many years, but forever, basically, cars have been illegally parking in the Brooklyn Borough Park, public square in the borough of Brooklyn in New York City for people who live outside the city. And apparently our mayor, Eric Adams, and his administration, he was previously the Brooklyn borough president, they were specifically over the top about this and basically treated it as their own private parking lot and would park their cars there and obstruct people's ability to use this public square for anything else. Even just like to walk through was a pain, trying to maneuver around all these cars that were illegally parked there. And he never did anything about it because he was one of the people illegally doing it. In one day, the new borough president of Brooklyn did away with cars parked there and has said there will be no more cars parked in this lot, and has already put up signage that says, if you park here, you will be towed. You cannot park here. So just an example of how much someone at even a very local level can change an entire community's experience. This guy just basically transformed how a public square is going to be able to be used by the people, as opposed to it being used by politicians who think they can just park their cars wherever because they're elected officials.
Well, I think some of that is also just if you see a car that's illegally parked in New York City, pro tip, if it's a Dodge Charger with illegal window tints, it's probably a cop car. It's probably a cop car. There are a lot of illegally parked cop cars in New York City too. And that's that's always been a big problem here. And, them speeding, even their non, police vehicles.
I would only recommend, we talked on Left Reckoning with Paul Prescott, who's running for state senate in Pennsylvania, and he's running for the state senate seat particularly because of this issue of where's the money if you're going to run at a local level, right? Municipalities are a bit hamstring, so his theory is that you run at a state level, and it's healthcare, expanding anything that you can there, and education, obviously, and Paul also talks about the just transition and green jobs and that sort of stuff. But I think that'd be where my reference is. Not, I am interested in that. I do think those sorts of candidates are as interesting to me, if not more, than the ones in the National Democratic Party right now.
Definitely, I think there's a good point to that too, and I think they're not unrelated in the sense that a lot of people's attention span for politics are wrongfully eaten up by the national level and being convinced that that's the place where the most change is going to happen or possible to happen. And a lot of local elections, like school board or any number of municipal boards, go really undervoted and underparticipated in, into the point where a lot of cities, I think New York City specifically is one of a few municipalities that has an unelected school board in America. And a lot of places, and it's definitely one of the biggest because of how much money our school board has, a multi-billion-dollar budget. And a lot of the reason why we have, the stated reason why we have an unelected school board, we have a board of appointed governors or something, I don't know what they're called, is because when we used to have a school board election, it was very underparticipated in. We had and a lot of places are like that because there's been a lot of attention, I think, purposely removed from a lot of these sort of smaller elections to bigger ones for fundraising reasons. They to funnel money into the larger DCCC, apparatus, as opposed to any, smaller political movement.
Thanks for the call, though. Great call.
You're welcome. Thanks, guys.
It's 2:45 already. Let me read some IMs.
Late.
What was that?
It's late. It'll be dark soon.
Yeah, I know. Mopping Up says, I'm morbidly hoping Kazakhstan has more internet outages so Bitcoin and all other cryptocurrencies crash. Oh, you're trying to open up another 2-hour-long conversation here, aren't you? Low Income Dick says, Ben Franklin wrote a whole piece that is him getting mocked for how fat and lazy he is by a personification of his gout. Johnny says, I know America spends too much on defense, but a strong U.S. defense is also better than alternatives, and we all benefit from America as sole superpower. The left attacks the military too much. What do you guys think should be the annual spend on the military? What?
Yeah, there's a lot of premises.
I don't think America should have a standing military at all.
Yeah, I mean,
I think the premise that America needs a standing military is false.
Yeah, I think at least the idea that the world or we, I mean, you say we benefit from, us being like the global empire. I think that's a very small subset of people. If he's writing that from the rich suburbs of Virginia, then he's right. They do. I don't think that. I think that's bullshit. But
I think we benefit from a Microsoft having a monopoly on like OSs in the 90s.
Yeah,
it's
right. Rory Gatto says, casting Chris Pratt as Mario is a great example of anti-Italian discrimination in this country. Right.
That was my problem with it.
Right. CIA Handler says, Donald Trump is posting some pretty cool statements on his website today. Oh, is he? I mean, I did see that he said that Joe Biden mentioned me by name today, even though Joe Biden didn't mention him by name today.
He was supposed to have a rally today too, but he moved it to 2 weeks from now. Like he's going to combine his Arizona rally with this one, as I guess it'd be in poor taste.
Oh wow, he is posting up a storm on his website.
He's become a early 2000s blogger now. Now that he's been banned from social. People say it ends your career, but you can just go back to like becoming a blogger. You should make a newsletter.
Right. His blog is back, I guess, because this is 1, 2, 3, 4 statements today, and some of them are just like 2 sentences long. Others are like a small essay long. And he's still pushing the 2020 election being stolen from him, which is not surprising. But it's 2022, buddy. Get a new. Country Mouse Tech says Sam regularly mentions that John Roberts was in the Brooks Brothers riot. Oh yeah. Aaron is not cool says, did they not learn the lessons from the celebs singing Imagine? I mean, I don't know if those celebs even learned their lesson, to be quite honest.
Gal Gadot said she thought it was in bad taste, though. I mean, one of them maybe has.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, Gal Gadot thinks it's in bad taste.
Yeah, right. You don't want to be the one who's still clinging to that after the Gal Gadot leaves.
I mean, I feel like she thinks it's in bad taste after the fact that she got like pilloried over it. I don't think she thinks it's in bad taste in general, honestly.
It was in bad taste when John Lennon did it.
All right. Wayne Kerr says the Dems are doomed. They really think people singing is compelling. Literally, go get any janitor that works the Capitol and have him describe his struggles. Tenfold more compelling. Yeah, but then that would be having to address actual issues and not like the vague nothingness that Lin-Manuel Miranda said about the importance of our democracy and the foundations that our Constitution is built on. It's just absolute, like, no difference between that nonsense and the nonsense from like any conservative patriot and with the bullshit they say. There's the vague nothingness using like words that sound patriotic to just say like democracy, Constitution.
There's just there's like a vague agreement amongst, the center, generally speaking, left or right, that America is exceptional. And, you can also see it like represented in the different ways in which like Democratic aligned voters and right wing, Republican aligned voters like justify invading countries. Like Democrats feel like it's because of like feminist, liberal, shallow issues, and Republicans just like killing people, obviously, or like, for oil. But, I think the larger, more interesting part is that there is this kind of very weird belief that if, self-actualization in this way, like, well, as long as I think of it differently, it makes it different in terms of like the material effect of reality is something that like liberal aligned voters have like conditioned themselves to believe is true about their their political choices. even if they result in like supporting the same thing, functionally as Republicans do. I don't know if this has to do with like, Hamilton, but God, I hate that. Such a terrible, terrible. Dear Theodosia.
Right.
Not even just like have them sing like the national anthem or something or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like a promotion.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
You can't even go see Hamilton now. Like it's closed. Like it's, you can watch it on Disney Plus.
It really is straight out of like Hillary doing masterclass. Like, what the fuck is this? It is like all Trump University, just but for liberals. It's why do they do this? Because it's bedtime stories for the adult babies that our politicians are actually accountable to. The rich adult babies, I should say, that our politicians are actually accountable to, that live in a fairy tale.
Right. Yeah. Everything's a grift and a scam and a marketing ploy nowadays. There's a lot of IMs, but I'm just gonna read a few more. Is MR Bing of Bong says, is MR replacing Emma with a CIA body double? Not a very good one if Sam is playing the role of Emma. Nelflo says, regarding January 3rd segment about Max Blumenthal, I learned Max is an unreliable source of news when I saw him doing pro-Maduro propaganda back in 2020, painting a very positive picture of Venezuela, while I personally had family members that had a lot of difficulty finding food, gas, and other necessities. Thanks to my personal knowledge and connection to Venezuela, it was clear to me that Blumenthal is unreliable, that it takes something like this or a brilliant takedown by a random British YouTuber to figure out what a reliable source of news is, why we have so much misinformation. For example, why would it take too quickly to convince someone that Pizzagate is not real? About the Venezuela thing, I mean, obviously, it's not just all black and white, and you have family who had different experience there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of I was going to jump in real quick, but there's a lot of anti-Maduro stuff, but I also remember that and not like running with it because I didn't frankly trust Max.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of times I saw things in the gray zone and was like, gotta hold the brakes here and see if anyone else.
Let's get secondary confirmation of that.
Yes. Italian American says, I'm offended by Chris Pratt playing Mario, not as an Italian, but as a fan of comedy. Two more IMs. Let's do two more IMs. Forresto says, people don't realize how easy it is to get elected for lower level local offices like the school board. I ran unopposed for a rural school board and ended up as one of 5 board members in charge of tens of millions of dollars in school spending. Anyone listening should absolutely run for office. Yes, especially when you think about the fact that it is conservatives right now who are taking advantage of those school board elections and the ability to get elected to them, like you just laid out here. That is scary, that what you just said combined with the fact that conservatives full well are taking advantage of this right now.
Well, I mean, I think it's kind of like it speaks to like complementary and also like the intrinsic problem with the messaging of the Democrats sometimes, especially with like that Imagine clip, which is that like time or history will not be kind to the bigots of today or the people who are causing problems of today. Because like, the arc of history trends towards justice or like generational politics, the kids are going to come in control and change things, blah, 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 blah. That, in many ways depresses liberals' imagination of what they should be doing now and excites Republicans' imagination of what they should be doing right now. Because, and like, Republicans' minds, they're losing ground every single day as we move into the future. And in liberals' minds, like they're gaining ground, even though it's obviously working backwards.
Right.
Oh, let me just, since we've gone late, plug my buddy Chris Leal at Leal for Texas. He's running in Dallas for State House District 114. Check him out.
And the final IM of the day, Jay Tingle. If Maddow had texted a Dem president during an Antifa attack on the Capitol, there would indeed be public hangings. Recall how Dems voted to get rid of Acorn and to condemn MoveOn.org for saying, General, betray us. I mean, you have a point, right? I mean, Democrats are absolutely cave and are babies when it comes to stuff like this. Absolutely. They try to play up the whole, we need to have decorum and be the adults in the room when it comes to like dumb shit like that, and actually like take responsibility for dumb shit like that and throw progressives and other leftist groups under the bus.
My feeling is that you should always go lower than your opponent. You should always, you show them that you're not afraid to get your hands dirty. Like when your opponent goes low, you should grab a shovel and you should just really just start digging a tunnel under them.
Yeah.
Unlike what Michelle Obama said.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with the drill tweet about you do not gotta ever hand it to them, that sort of thing. Like, yeah, like
I mean, it's amazing. Just look at, like, to me, the a great recent example is like Ted Cruz literally out there saying just the other day that Democrats better get ready, because when Republicans take back the House later this year, we're gonna immediately file impeachment against Joe Biden. And then the response from the White House is, Ted Cruz should be focusing on working together with Democrats for true bipartisan policy instead of talking about silliness like this. It's like the guy is literally saying he's going to fucking kick you out of the president out of office for no reason. And the Republicans are going to like do that shit. And you're here saying what you should really be doing is working with us. It's like unbelievable, these guys.
That's such a frustrating part about our political culture too. And like there's nothing that someone can do in bad faith, or even just openly admit to be doing in bad faith, that is allowed to change how you interact with them. Like in a courtroom, you say, "Oh, hostile witness, let's just start badgering this person." But it seems to be a point of pride of Democrats and Democratic aligned people that no matter how bad you're mistreated or how unreasonable or irrational or unmovable your opponent is, you should still pretend as though they're behaving in good faith, because that's the sign of a mature person. I think that's turning a lot of people off. I think that honestly, that's the thing, especially post-pandemic and post-Trump, that the treatment of people who just last week you were saying as these are existential threats to democracy, the Republican Party, Trump, these are existential threats to democracy and to your livelihood, your kids, they're going to, they're Nazis, to suddenly on a dime be, we got to be bipartisan again. Obviously some people, most of them have columns, are entranced by that kind of bipartisanship. But I think normal people who go about their day-to-day lives see that as you just can't square that circle.
Right. It's amazing. These guys are dangerous, but we got to work with them. It's it's unbelievable.
We have to reach across the aisle to these virulent racists who we're going to tell you, if you do not vote against in the next election, is going to end the world. But these are also our best friends.
Right. And they even on top of that, that's the argument they use to defeat people to the left of them when they're being primaried or in a primary election. Oh, that leftist who said he's going to fight for you and do whatever he can to fight for you, and how he's always criticizing the Republicans. I mean, how is he going to work with these guys and make it happen? That's how you could trust me. And then, of course, they win the election somehow based on that shit. And then they get into office, and it's like, these guys are an existential threat. They're progressive. That primaried me is right. But I will work with them. But the only problem, of course, again, is that they don't work with me because they hate my guts.
I think a lot of people make the mistake of viewing things like Democratic platforms and plans as though, in goals, promises that they make, explicit promises that they make, as though they're real and they are going to be implemented, when in reality, they're just symbols. They're symbols of the Democratic Party's emotional and intellectual maturity over Republican parties, and to expect them to fulfill those promises is just a little bit churlish, Matt. You can't expect them to actually follow through with any of that stuff. Did they ever make that website about getting free tests? Because it's only January 6th, but how many days are in January?
The administration officially told people either yesterday or the day before that if they're looking for a testing site, then they should Google it.
The website is called Google, motherfucker.
Right. Yeah, that was the official position from the administration.
They put a link on their website that goes to that thing where you click it and it just types it into Google for you.
Let me Google that for you.
Let me Google that for you. Which is just it just smacks of going back to the Obamacare or ACA website rollout, and their just inability to get that off the ground. Because at the end of the day, Google is just not a very efficient website anymore. Between the algorithm messing around with ads and shit, it's nowhere near as efficient as you would want it to be for something that you're relying on for your health.
Right. I mean, if you think about it, if you wanted something to attack the administration for, if you were on the other side and you wanted them to lose an election, you would point out that, and obviously this would be in semi bad faith because there are reasons for this, such as lockdowns being ended and no one basically is being careful as they were in 2020. But they could point out that, more people actually died of COVID in 2021 than did in 2020 in the United States. But they would never do that because they don't believe COVID is actually something to actually be afraid of or take care of or actually do anything about. Like, so they back themselves into this weird world where they just have to not mention that, even though that would be like semi-fair game.
I feel like people mention it all the time, but it still seems incredibly weird. I feel like whenever I mean, you can't really count like mentions on Twitter because like that's just like a lazy way of finding examples of something that could just be like one or two people saying something. But like I feel like I've seen like, you know, people present that argument disingenuously rhetorically too, because like that's a big like right-wing pundit trick, also like Nate Silver pundit trick of like well, some people might say that more people have died under Joe Biden than under Trump. Does that mean that Joe Biden has done poorly to combat the virus? Absolutely, you know, absolutely, you know, so did Trump, you know, but mostly we've just. If anything changed, it was the creation of the vaccine was used as a very, you know, typically American, typically West get rich quick scheme or fix the problem quick scheme. The moment you got vaccine, mask off inside, don't got to worry about the virus. And all people heard was mask, not the vaccine is out, whether I get it or not, you know, mask off, we don't have to worry about the virus. And, you know, that was the beginning of the end. Because in the larger commentary about what's wrong with America in the sense that like you can't enact certain policies on a local level and expect them to have the kind of impact they need to actually change things like guns, climate change, you know, infrastructure, et cetera, is kind of just like part of a larger conversation we never have about the dysfunction of this country because of that thing. Like you can't just do, you know, our borders being porous to like various, you know, to each other means that you can't have that kind of thing.
Right. All right. Everyone else will get the vaccine, and then that'll cover me, the one guy who won't get the vaccine. And then, of course, we know how that worked out with a lot of people just choosing not to get it.
Yeah, that's it. A lot of those one people are grouped together, but you know, since we don't have a society, people don't view that as a thing. So it's just like I'm still an individual.
Right. Right. All right, guys, it's been a pleasure. We went long, but good. Without any official.
We started late.
Right, that too, and without you know, an Emma or a Sam to hold us back and make us end the show at a certain time, we could just go on forever. But I think now would be a good time to say goodbye to everybody. It was fun seeing you guys for the first time in 2022. Matt Leck, Brandon Sutton, and Bradley. Do people know Bradley's last name? Or do we
I think you forgot all of our last names, to be honest, the way you paused there.
I did pause between Brandon and Sutton. That's true.
It's fine.
It took me a
you
second
didn't watch
to
me
remember.
you didn't watch me on Majority Report when you were in college, just the other way around. So it's fine.
Right. Guys, it was a pleasure. Looking forward to many more in 2022. See you guys. Majority Report will see you tomorrow. And me and Brandon will see you guys next week.
See you, folks.
See ya. Thanks.
It might take all the strength I got to get to where I want, but I know somehow I'm gonna get there. I wasn't looking when I just got caught between the truth and the light bar. But finding out won't make me feel any better. Yeah, I know the clock is ticking, but the meds are gonna kick in, and my pilot light's shining bright. I guess somewhere the choice was made for the option where you don't get paid, for the road that bends before it finally breaks you. I guess somehow I lost my drive between